Part 2, Chapter 17 of The Lonely Warrior by Claude Washburn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It was afternoon on the last day of December when Stacy arrived at the little station of Pickens, North Carolina. His face had a sunken, ravaged look, and grime from the repulsively dirty train made its underlying pallor ghastly. But Stacy was not really in any such abject condition as he appeared to be. He was worn out, beaten back at every point, but something in him still hung on. His eyes were tired, but alive. In the train, which was crowded, as only a branch line train of the Southern Railway can be crowded, with commercial travelers and with slovenly mothers publicly nursing crying children, much too old to be nursed either publicly or privately, he had listened with even a little amusement to talk of how much better the service would be as soon as the government turned the road back to the company. And his will to get away by himself, out of touch with men and women, was strong and intense, sustaining him. He was not repelled by the sordid ugliness of the station and the glimpse of Main Street, but felt rather an unemotional sense of homecoming, which any native of Pickens would have attributed to the fact that Stacy's mother's people, though now all dead or widely scattered, had been the Pickens Barclays, but which more likely arose in Stacy because the end of his quest was in sight. Anyway, here came old Elijah, grinning broadly, hat in hand, his fringe of white hair blowing about his nearly bald black head. He shook Stacy's hand vigorously. "I sure almost thought you wasn't on that there train, Mr. Stacy," he declared. "There didn't seem nothin' but babies." And he carried Stacy's bag across the platform to a buggy. "Hello," said Stacy. "You're driving Duke. What will Mr. Carroll say to that, Elijah?" "Well, Mr. Stacy, sir, I just had to get you home somehow. These here Fords at the garage, just as like as not, they get stuck on the Meldrum Road. I wouldn't have drove Duke, 'cept for that. It's been rainin' a powerful lot." "Haven't they mended that road yet?" Stacy inquired, getting into the buggy. "No, sir, not yet. You stop that, Duke, sir," he called to the horse, who, impatient of the shafts, was curvetting sideways down the street. 2 or 3 people came up to the buggy and shook Stacy's hand, and he replied to their greetings as heartily as he could. But he was eager to be rid of them, and felt relief when presently the town was left behind, and the buggy was plowing through the waste of red mud known as the Meldrum Road. He lit a cigarette and leaned back in the seat, drawing in deep breaths of the damp, chilly air, and letting Elijah's words run on unchecked and unheeded. The landscape was a sweet and pleasant one even now in winter, when the oaks and the poplars were bare of leaves. The rolling brick-colored fields, planted with corn, were interspersed with patches of woods, where hills rose, blue with spruce and dark green with white pine. Beyond were the low friendly mountains. Log cabins were scattered about here and there, with pigs, dogs, and ragged children playing indiscriminately before them. All the people Stacy met or passed on the road raised their hats gravely, and Stacy raised his in return. He was enough of this country, and also sufficiently intelligent, to have no sentimental northern fancies about its romantic aristocracy. He had no more illusions about the people of Pickens than about the people of Vernon. If the latter were vulgar, the former were bigoted. Their greed took on gigantic forms. Here it revealed itself in petty ways. Here, as there, he thought, it was the one permanent human instinct. He did not know what labor conditions were now at the knitting mills. He knew what they had been 6 years ago, the last time he had been down, and he was skeptical of any change. Yet the sight of people here bothered him less than in Vernon, it seemed. That, he thought idly, was because here the inhabitants were more a part of their country, stood out less blatantly against the landscape, blended with it, or almost. Not because they and it were picturesque, but because they had belonged to their country for many generations, whereas in Vernon nobody had been molded by continuous residence into harmony with anything. And Stacy reflected that only in rural New England and the South did you get this impression of harmony between landscape and people, as though they had mutually made one another. Really, they were at bottom very alike, rural New England and the South, though each would have been shocked at the idea, each with a continuous past from which it had sprung, to which it belonged. A tight, narrow, little past, but authentic. Stacy was roused from meditation by a sense that Elijah had been saying the same words a great many times, and that the words were a question. "How's that, Elijah?" he asked. "I was jest sayin', Mr. Stacy, as how I reckoned you'd be wantin' some colored girl to cook for you and make your bed." "No," said Stacy calmly, "I don't want anyone. You'll do that, Elijah." The old man grew melancholy. "Sure, Mr. Stacy, if you say so," he replied sadly. "I'll walk myself to the bone for you, but I just don't know if I positively got the time to do everything just right. I got a powerful lot to do, Mr. Stacy." "What is it, Elijah?" "Well, I got to look after Duke, suh, and then there's all that big place to see to." "A couple of men working on it, aren't there?" "Yes, suh, but that's just it. They don't work less'n I stands over them all the time." "They probably don't work if you do. I don't want a maid, Elijah. You can hire a woman to come in and clean for a couple of hours in the morning, but I don't want to see her." "Yes, sir," said the Negro, in a tone of aggrieved resignation. But he got over it almost at once, and was presently babbling on as before. When at last they approached the Carroll property, Stacy looked about him more attentively, with a wistful sense of what was past, such as one might feel in reading over old letters, full of youthful affection, to someone all but forgotten now. The house, 3 miles distant from the town, was low and rambling, with deep verandas and numerous sleeping porches. It sat on a knoll, among 10 acres of sloping lawn and perhaps 90 of oak and pine woods. And from its veranda one looked away, west, for miles up a narrowing valley between tree-clad mountains. Valley Ridge, Stacy remembered, half humorously, half painfully. Julie had tried to call the place in her boarding school days, and had come down one Christmas vacation with heavy blue stationery embossed in silver with that legend, at which their father had remarked that if she ever used any of that Princess Alice abomination, he'd get some pink paper for himself, have "The Pig-Sty" engraved for a heading, and write letters on it to the principal of Julie's school. It was odd, Stacy thought, that the recollection of this trivial incident should remain in his mind as something touching, more touching than the memory of really emotional events, his mother's death for instance. How things clung, the absurdest things. One could never get rid of them. They were like tattered cobwebs in corners. But they had reached the end of the driveway by now, and Stacy sprang out. After supper he sat, huddled in an overcoat, on the wide front veranda of the house. The low mountains, only a mile to the north, were hazy blue in the twilight. Later the moon rose, and soft brightness spread over everything. Straight ahead the narrow valley took on shimmering pearly tints, range after luminous range of mountains intersecting its sides, like filmy theater drops in a stage setting. In the midst of this pale silence, a sense of reposefulness came over Stacy. It did not spring from any achieved harmony. He had harmonized nothing. He had, as he was perfectly aware, merely bolted, and nothing that he had felt was gone. His pain at Phil's death, his compassion for Catherine, his hatred of men, his resentment at this rag of a world, all this and everything was still alive within him, but submerged beneath his isolation. When he thought of men, he still thought of them as greedy beasts of prey. But it was possible for him now, he believed, not to see them and be one of them. At last, when it had grown very late, he went up to the bed Elijah had made for him on a sleeping porch, from which, too, he had the same view of the shining valley, and so fell asleep. And now began for Stacy as solitary a life as that of any medieval hermit. Every morning he went out on Duke for a 15 or 20-minute ride over mountain roads and paths, returning splashed with mud and frequently drenched through, for the season was exceptionally rainy. And after the late cold luncheon, which he trained Elijah to leave spread out for him, he would set off again on foot for the woods. The letters that came for him he tossed unopened into the library desk, except those from his father and Catherine. Theirs he read, but hastily, and replied to them with an effort. He did not so much mind reading, or even answering Mr. Carroll's. He did so almost mechanically. But Catherine's were different. Matter of fact, and never touching on general ideas, they were yet, in some cool way, intimate, and certainly without the shyness that had always hampered Catherine in talking to Stacy. It was as though in these letters she assumed that he was real, as he felt that she was. And this was painful to him, dragging him back into the world from which he had fled. Writing to her was hard, and he was aware that his letters must be dull. But Catherine did not write often, only once every 2 or 3 weeks. Stacy also read a letter from Julie, but Julie was a poor correspondent, writing, when positively forced to, in an odd stilted manner quite uncharacteristic of her pleasant self. Only this one effort came from her. But Stacy would not have minded 50 letters as unreal. The postscript, however, did sound like Julie, and brought Stacy back for a moment to Vernon. "How did Irene know where you were when Phil was dying?" it demanded. Oh, so it was Irene who had told Julie, and Julie Catherine, that he was at Clarefield. He stared ahead of him, recalling the tragedy, then laid Julie's letter among the others in the desk drawer. A few people called on Stacy, and he was polite enough to them, but he never returned their visits, and soon no one troubled him further. It was a difficult matter to drive out from town through all that mud. When, rarely, he did talk with people, he received an impression that they were literally very far off. Their voices seemed to reach him from a distance, or deadened as though through a barrier of fog. It was like conversation in a dream. Sometimes on his rides he would get so far away, or be caught in so terrific a storm, that he would stay overnight in some mountaineer's cabin. On these occasions he was welcomed with a grave courtesy unmarred by apologies for what his hosts had to offer. The cabin invariably had but one room and a lean-to. Supper over, the women would go to bed, while the master of the house and Stacy smoked their pipes outside. Then the two of them would enter, undress in the dark, and lie down. It did not irk Stacy to be with these people. They seemed apathetic and emotionless, and their eyes had an abstracted look. On the other hand, if human feeling had faded in him, his long-neglected fancy was waking to new life. His mind grew, like an enchanted wood, into a tangle of imaginings that gave him sometimes a feeling of release, a lifting sense of delight. Similes fitted through it rapidly. A cloud shadow on a blue mountain was like a veil flung across the face of a goddess, heightening her loveliness. The sudden sound of a brook in the forest was like shy laughter. What was laughter? Something delicately unhuman, perhaps, an expression of the youthful buoyant relation between Earth's creatures and the earth. Biologists said that animals could not laugh. Idiotic! It was only animals and children that could laugh. A dog laughed. Even Duke could laugh. It was true that cats could not, but this was because they were not primitive animals, but civilized. Men did not laugh, they smirked or ricané. Stacy could not think of the English word and indolently did not try to. He noted with calm contempt this revival of fancifulness in himself, saying that he had reverted to the sentimentalism of his early life. For all along he was contemptuous of himself for his surrender. Further than this he would not look. He avoided himself as persistently as he avoided others. Yet, in his reading, he did not turn to poetry and romance. He read Tolstoy, Samuel Butler, and Thomas Hardy. He cared, in fact, for no books that did not treat solely and squarely of men's relations to one another. He would have nothing to do with men. He would read of nothing else. Months passed, with Stacy scarcely aware of their smooth succession. He was like a man asleep, vaguely dreaming. But it was only a sleep, a semi-conscious state into which one sinks, however pleasantly, when tired. Even in those moments when his fancy played delightedly over some sudden glimpse of beauty, he was at bottom dissatisfied, like a man struggling achingly in a dream to unfold and make real the unsubstantial vision of his mistress. By this time April had come. The Judas trees had burned themselves out. The fresh pale green of oaks and maples shimmered against the dark green of the pines. The forests were white with dogwood blossom, and on the lower mountain slopes masses of flame azalea made the ground beneath the trees appear on fire. Much of Stacy's present calm came through his freedom from men, but much too from the silent satisfaction of his starved sense of beauty. He read less now and went on longer rides. But his calm was insecure. Something impetuous fluttered within him, too strong for this life of fancy. Mentally he was still isolated. Physically he was restless, stirred tumultuously by the spring, called to union with the warm, thrilling life all about him. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Lonely Warrior by Claude Washburn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. About a quarter of a mile from Stacy's house lay the village of Meldrum, straggling along one side of a small river, which, having flowed prettily through the Carroll property, its steep banks massed with rhododendrons, issued thence into practical life, like a businessman after a condescending hour with the arts. It fell, that is, into rapids, the water power from which was utilized by a small hosiery factory. Around this plant had grown up the village, consisting of a company store and of some 50 incredibly abject huts, leaning at strange angles, propped up anyhow when in acute danger of collapse by logs. The effect of the whole like that of a vorticist picture. The beginning of many of Stacy's rides led him perforce through this ignoble place. The brick factory itself stood close beside the road he must follow, on a narrow strip of ground between it and the river. And through the broken glass of its windows slovenly girls leered out at him or shouted uncomplimentary remarks, and he could see the pale, hard-featured faces of 10- and 12-year-old children. If Stacy was walking Duke, he would wave his hat as he passed, but mostly he went through the town at a gallop. He rode well, and with his impassive, rather stern face, he must have looked like some callous medieval condottiere. No one in Meldrum would have heard of condottieri, but the effect would be the same. Really, however, Stacy was far from impassive. This misery of which he caught a glimpse troubled him profoundly, the more since, so far as he could see, there was nothing he could do about it. Yet, oddly, he rode through Meldrum oftener than he needed to. The house of the factory owner, a Mr. Langdon, stood on the crest of a low hill, some distance back to the left, just before the village began. On one side, its grounds adjoined the Carroll property. It was an imposing pillared mansion, built as a plantation house before the Civil War. But Stacy gazed across at it grimly each time that he rode out through Meldrum. However, he did not see what he could do about this either. He tried to dismiss both house and village from his thoughts. Mr. Langdon himself, a pleasant-faced elderly man with a young wife and 3 small daughters, he knew by sight and nodded to curtly when they happened to meet. But for all his deliberate isolation, he had been unable not to pick up a few scraps of gossip here and there. And also there was Elijah, an unquenchable fountain of information. So Stacy learned that the Langdons were a South Carolina family, that they had formerly owned the house and 1,000 acres round about, the whole valley indeed, including the property that was now Mr. Carroll's, that they had lost everything during the Civil War and emigrated to Georgia, that it was only 5 years ago that the present Mr. Langdon had returned to buy back the family home and with it the hosiery factory that had been erected by someone else. Stacy also learned, listening distractedly to Elijah, that there was no love for the factory owner among his employees, and that one young fellow, "Yes, sir, he's bad, Mr. Stacy," had said how he was going to get Mr. Langdon one day. Well, and then, thought Stacy, with a shrug of his shoulders, finding the intention laudable enough, but seeing no solution of anything in it. But one night toward the end of April, Stacy, lying awake on his sleeping porch, became aware of an odd glow in the moonless night. A fire, of course, he thought, as he got quickly out of bed to make sure that it was not in his own house. Houses hereabouts always burned down sooner or later, what with the general carelessness and the lack of any fire department. But from his porch, which faced west, Stacy could not see the fire. It must be somewhere to the east, since it reddened the near side of the shrubbery on the lawn and shone fantastically against the glossy leaves of a tulip tree. He hurried down the hall to the other end of the house, but tall trees and the distant barrier of white pines that marked the Carroll boundary cut off his view, and he could make out only that the fire was somewhere in Melbourne. The confused murmur of many voices reached him. He threw on some clothes, slipped a flashlight into his pocket, then ran downstairs. Elijah was just starting up then. The old man was breathless with haste and excitement. It am Mr. Langdon's house at's burnin', Mr. Stacy," he stuttered. "My Lord, but she sure is burnin', sir." For a moment Stacy was rather pleased at the news. Then he shrugged his shoulders at feeling so childish an emotion. "All right," he said. "I'll go over and see if I can help." Running easily, he did the 1/4 of a mile in 3 minutes, and, vaulting a fence, came out upon the sloping lawn of the Langdon home. It was covered with people, shouting and moving about busily, mostly workers from the factory, and strewn with such household goods as had been rescued. The east wing of the house was burning fiercely. Flames lapped the roof of the central part, and black smoke curled out of its upper windows. The west wing was not yet burning, though its blistered paint was peeling off in great flakes, and little spirals of smoke rose from its roof where sparks had caught. Glancing around him in the flickering light, Stacy perceived a young woman sitting motionless on an overturned mahogany sideboard, a child in her lap and 2 others clinging to her skirts. He went up to her quickly. "Mrs. Langdon," he said stiffly, "I'm Stacy Carroll. Please tell me what to do." He spoke stiffly, not because he was unfriendly, but because Mrs. Langdon, like all the rest of the people around him, seemed far away, unrelated, a mere distant mathematical fact about which no emotion was possible. "Thank you, Mr. Carroll," she said pleasantly. "I'm afraid there's nothing. The men are getting out what they can." "Well, I can help with that," he replied. The youngest child, a girl of 6, was crying bitterly in her mother's arms. "Mitzi, I want my Mitzi," she sobbed monotonously. "Who's Mitzi?" Stacy asked quickly. "Some pet still in the house?" Mrs. Langdon smiled. "Mitzi is only Helen's doll," she explained. We forgot it in the hurry, and now it's too late. Her room was full of smoke even when we left it." Stacy, too, smiled, ever so faintly touched. "I'll go and see if I can help Mr. Langdon," he remarked. "Where is he?" "Oh, thank you," said the young woman. "He's there at the west end of the house. Please don't let him climb in again. He's strained his ankle." A ladder had been placed against the low porch at the end of the west wing. Stacy scrambled up to the roof of the porch, where he found Mr. Langdon and others among a heterogeneous collection of household goods that had been carried out through an open second-story window. The tin roof was uncomfortably hot, and there was a good deal of smoke. Mr. Langdon was directing the lowering to the ground of a sofa, and pausing between times to toss down less fragile belongings as they were brought out to him through the window. He appeared quite calm and greeted Stacy courteously. "Mrs. Langdon told me you had strained your ankle," Stacy remarked. "Hadn't you better go down and let me tend to this for you?" "That is very kind of you, sir," Mr. Langdon replied, "but I am all right. I regret that I cannot go inside with the others." "Well, I can do that anyway," said Stacy curtly, and, disregarding the others' protests, went quickly over to the window and through it. The room beyond was very hot, but not yet burning, and there was not even much smoke. 3 or 4 men were gathering up the few objects still remaining in it, and a frightened negro servant was standing very close to the window and directing their efforts. No one paid the least attention to his instructions, but a youth coming in with a mattress from a room beyond called, "Come on in there, Joe," at which the negro shook his head vigorously, and the others laughed. Stacy went through another door. This room was smoky and also nearly emptied of its furnishings. But 3 doors opened out of it, and beyond one of these Stacy found himself at once in a hot choking mist. Here he was alone. He drew out his flashlight and, his eyes smarting, explored the room. It was a sitting room, he saw, Mrs. Langdon's probably, and he could be of some use after all. For here hung a small maçonnier, and there on a table was a vase. "C'est vrai," he remarked hoarsely. "Better than mattresses." He gathered up the vase, jerked the picture from the wall, and stumbled, coughing, from the room. Just outside the door he ran into the young man of the mattress. "Here," said Stacy, wheezing, "take this, carefully, to Mr. Langdon, will you?" "Sure," said the young man, who was chewing tobacco steadily. "You been in there?" he inquired, waving his hand at the door. Stacy nodded. "Well, wait a minute and I'll go back in with you when I've toted these out." "I'll have to wait a minute," Stacy replied, and the young man departed. Presently he returned, and together the two went back into the sitting room for more loot, emerging dripping with sweat and half choked. Yet Stacy was beginning to enjoy himself. They tried the other 2 rooms, the doors of which Stacy had already noticed. From the first they got, with difficulty, a fine rug, slightly scorched, and a mahogany stand. The second seemed impossible, a mass of black smoke. "What's in there, I wonder?" said Stacy hoarsely. "I dunno," the young fellow replied. "We might ask that nigger, Joe." Only 2 or 3 men were left now, even in the room next the porch, and Joe was definitely on the point of getting out of the window. However, he paused for an instant to answer the question. "That there room, that's Miss Helen's bedroom. Don't you go there, sir," he said, and vanished. Stacy reflected, with a half smile, then hurried back, his laconic acquaintance still at his side. Voices shouted at them from the porch. The house was a furnace now. There was a heavy roaring in the air, and every little while the sound of something crashing down. Nevertheless, Stacy plunged into the bedroom, and so, too, did his companion. It was unbearable, but at least one could see. A vivid flickering light shot through the smoke. After a moment, Stacy made out the crib, dived for a blackened, almost unrecognizable object that lay on the smoldering sheets, and leaped back just as a beam fell with a shower of sparks from the ceiling. Together he and his companion fled back to the room next the porch and leaned, coughing and choking, against the window. The room was empty. "What did you get?" Stacy asked hoarsely at last. "A hoss," replied the other with a grin, holding up a toy. "I got a doll," said Stacy weakly. And all at once, there in this burning room, it was as though something snapped within him. The strange barrier was down. The world came rushing up to meet him. He burst into a helpless fit of laughter. Do I look as wild as you do?" he gasped, gazing at the other's grimy face and singed hair. "You sure look pretty bad," said the young man. Stacy pulled himself together. "I should say we'd better get out of here," he remarked. "I reckon we had." They scrambled out over the smoking porch and down the ladder, surprised at the anxious group awaiting them. Mr. Langdon seized Stacy's hand. "Thank God you're down safely, Mr. Carroll," he said. "We were worried, sir. You shouldn't have stayed so long. You're not burnt? Your clothes—" "But the things you saved were very precious to me. The maisonnière." Stacy laughed. "Glad to be of some use," he replied easily. "Where is Mrs. Langdon?" "Back here out of the heat, just a few steps," said the other, and led the way limping. The crowd had grown larger during Stacy's absence. There were half a dozen small motor cars, too, on the lawn, and the lights of others, standing in the road, 100 yards distant, were visible. Mrs. Langdon uttered an exclamation at Stacy's appearance, but he gave her no chance to thank him. "Helen," he called, "is this Mitzi?" and held out the burnt, blackened doll. The child seized it with a scream of joy. "Mitzi, Mitzi!" she cried. Mrs. Langdon stared helplessly. "Do you mean to say that you risked your life to save that doll, Mr. Carroll?" she demanded, half laughing, half crying. "Oh no, there wasn't any danger, except the choking," Stacy replied. However, it occurred to him suddenly that to run risks blithely for a doll was just what he had done, and that this was somehow, he didn't know, connected with the odd change of heart he was feeling. "Oh," he exclaimed suddenly, "and my friend saved a horse. Where's he gone?" "I got the hoss, Mr. Stacy," said Elijah, coming forward with the toy. "Mr. Jim Bradley, he give it to me to bring. He's done gone, Mr. Bradley is." "That was sweet of him," Mrs. Langdon exclaimed. "What the dickens did he go for?" Stacy remarked regretfully. "Jim Bradley?" He'd heard the name somewhere. "You must come over to my place for the night," he observed. No, it would be silly to go into town when I've all those empty rooms," he added quickly, as Mr. Langdon attempted to protest. "And you'll want to get back here early in the morning to see to things." He was insistent and they, no doubt, were very tired. At any rate, they yielded. "A cousin of mine has brought his Ford around," said Mr. Langdon. "He'll take us over presently, but—" "Good, then Elijah and I will cut across and get things ready," Stacy concluded. Back at the house, Stacy plunged into a bath, then hurriedly put on other clothes. But all at once he paused in his dressing and uttered an exclamation. Jim Bradley? Of course! It was the name of the young man who, Elijah said, had threatened to "get" Mr. Langdon. Stacy smiled, then frowned. Before long the Langdons arrived with a carload of rescued clothes. Stacy welcomed them cordially. "Elijah has your rooms ready," he said, "and there's a bathroom next to one of them." "Thank you," murmured Mrs. Langdon. "I'll put the children to bed and leave you my husband meanwhile." He helped them upstairs with their things, looked down with a smile at Helen as her father laid her, fast asleep, on the bed, Mitzi still clutched in her arms, then returned with Mr. Langdon to the big living room. They sat down, and Stacy gazed at his guest with interest. A simple, likable man, with a kindly face and extremely well bred. "I trust," said Stacy pleasantly, as he offered him a cigarette, "that you carried adequate insurance?" Mr. Langdon smiled faintly. "About enough to cover the first mortgage," he returned quietly. Stacy paused in the act of lighting a match and stared. "The whole investment was a mistake, sir," his guest continued mildly. "For sentimental reasons I am sorry to lose the house, but it was a burden. The factory has never paid, and the rate of interest banks hereabouts demand on loans is ruinous, 10 to 12%. I shall sell out for what I can get and go back to Macon. Forgive my troubling you with such mention of personal affairs." "On the contrary, I am interested and sorry," Stacy replied sincerely. He fell silent for a moment. "So the villain of the piece must be sought elsewhere? Among the bankers?" Stacy shook his head. "Not there either." He pulled himself back to his duties as host. After a time Mrs. Langdon came down. She had put on another dress, and there was a touch of coquetry in her manner toward Stacy. Both she and her husband were behaving like good sports, he thought. Elijah brought in coffee and sandwiches, and the three talked pleasantly together for half an hour. Nevertheless, Stacy was relieved when his guests went up to bed. Somehow he seemed to have broken free. He was no longer a pacing animal in a cage, and he wanted to think things out. He leaned against the mantelpiece and gazed off across the room with grave, abstracted eyes. His absurd rescue of that wretched doll, why had so trivial an act seemed to shake him out of a long lethargy? The answer leaped up at him almost at once. Not the kindness, but the sheer futility of his act. Just this was what had struck him as a heartening revelation. He had risked his life for a doll. Jim Bradley had sworn to get an enemy, then had gone through flames to save his enemy's household goods. For, thinking swiftly, Stacy perceived now that he had not told the truth when he had asserted passionately to Mrs. Latimer that he found the world chaos, with no scheme, nothing. What reason for anger in that? No, as a youth he had assumed the world to be built upon an agreeable scheme, and then afterward, all unknown to himself, he had fancied it an evil scheme. It was neither. It was what he had insincerely called it, chaos, a groveling, incoherent assemblage of facts. The thought of greed, he had been obsessed by it just because he had seen it as something permanent, consistent, and successful. Pshaw! An ugly thing, greed, but pitiful and futile like everything else. Where did it get anyone? The greedy man was a man struggling for happiness. Well, did he achieve happiness? Hate died out of Stacy. You could not hate what was a failure. So much he made out in a series of flashes. Much more, that lay behind, was more obscure. He dropped into an armchair and sat there, motionless for a long time, reflecting intensely. Sometimes he would spring to his feet and pace up and down the room for a while, and light a fresh cigarette or pause to finger abstractly some vase or book, then return to his chair. It was not, of course, he understood, this one evening's performance that had shocked him into sanity, or what he hoped was sanity. This long isolation from men, from a world interested only in economics, had calmed him, for in it his youthful gift of fancy, choked back for so long, had been let loose again. You could not choke things back without suffering for it. He had been like a man living in compartments, first in one, then in another. That was wrong. He ought to live wholly, with all of himself. What he had been in his youth, that too he still was. Nothing in one ever died. It was as far as Stacy could get, and this only slowly, with difficulty. But he could, he thought, go back to the real world now and start over again. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Lonely Warrior by Claude WASHBURN. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Stacy had left Vernon in December. It was on an afternoon in May that he returned to it. Tulips bloomed gaily in well-tended beds along the boulevard at which he gazed from his taxi. A fresh spring smell was in the air. The city was at its best. Stacy looked at it inquiringly, almost as though it were new to him. And in a sense it was new, for he did not feel toward it in any way that he had felt before. He saw the business buildings standing angularly against the blue sky, the handsome residences of varied architecture, the wide streets that were rivers of motor cars, and he noted, as often, that aesthetically the city was faulty and aspiring, and that socially it was energetic and confident. He received again an impression of people striving relentlessly to attain certain things and clinging to them desperately when attained. But he did not feel for these characteristics either admiration or disapproval, affection or distaste. What he did feel was curiosity, because it seemed to him that he knew very little about Vernon really, and an odd touch of pity. For the first time it struck him as rather pathetic to care so hard about motor cars and bathrooms and servants. Here were wealthy men riding triumphantly in imported Rolls Royces, and poor men riding in Fords or walking and hating the rich men. What a to-do! Oh well, it couldn't be helped, Stacy supposed. Economics were the order of the day. Presently he reached his father's house. "Hello, Parker," he said to the surprised servant who opened the door. "I'm back, you see, and without so much as sending a wire. How are you? Mr. Carroll well? Take this bag up to my room for me, will you please? I certainly do need a bath. Oh yes, I've had lunch, thanks." An hour later he strolled down to the dining room for a whiskey and soda, then, glass in hand, into the library. And there, sitting with a book in a high-backed chair, was Catherine. "Why, Catherine!" Stacy exclaimed, going toward her quickly and holding out his hand. She had risen swiftly, as surprised as he. She was wearing a black dress, but with a wide pointed collar of white lace at her bare throat. She looked firm and grave and slender. "Well, isn't this jolly?" he said, shaking her hand cordially. "What are you doing here?" "Didn't you get my last letter?" she asked, with some embarrassment. "I think your father wrote you too." "I did get your letter and one from father," he replied, "just before I left Pickens, but, to tell you the truth, I've brought them back unopened in my bag. I thought it would be so much nicer to talk with you both. It sounds rude and unappreciative, but I didn't mean it that way." She was still gazing at him, and he saw that she was distressed about something and as shy as ever. "Sit down, do," he said. She obeyed. "You see," she began slowly, "I didn't think you'd be back yet. And a little while ago, when the rent period on our house was up, your father said, he's been so awfully kind to us always, and he said—" "Catherine," Stacy interrupted, "it's oppressive to see anyone with as much to say as you always have, so unable to say it." She bit her lip. "My father said, 'I insist on your coming to live here. It's a big place and I need a housekeeper.'" But, though he laughed, Stacy did not feel mirthful. He had a sudden perception of how lonely his father had been, how lonely Catherine had been. "Yes," she returned, "that was what he said. And I was weak enough to accept, though I knew it was only kindness on his part. But I was going away when you came back, Stacy." "Oh," he remarked, "you were." Again she bit her lip. "I mean," she added quickly, "that we might have been in your way and—" "Catherine," said Stacy, getting up and standing beside her, "I think your being here is delightful. I should feel very badly if you went away. There's my hand on it." She looked at him in a puzzled manner and thanked him, rather unsteadily, because he had been so cordial. A little of her shyness had vanished when he sat down again. "You came back," she said. He nodded. "I've ridden everywhere there was to ride, so all at once I decided I'd come back to the world." And he became silent. "Where are the boys?" he demanded suddenly. "At school," she replied. "But it's 4 now. They'll be here any minute." And only a little later they did come in. Jack was unrestrained from the first, but Carter, probably coached by his mother, was impressively correct until he caught sight of Stacy and threw reserve to the winds. The library echoed with noise, and there was a touch of color in Catherine's cheeks when at 5 o'clock Mr. Carroll opened the door of the room and stood at the threshold looking in. "Well, son!" he exclaimed. Stacy sprang up. "Surprise party, Dad," he remarked, shaking his father's hand. "Quite a good one, don't you think?" "I should say so," Mr. Carroll replied, while Catherine quieted the boys and made them sit beside her with a book. "How was everything down there? Did you ride over that Garrett Creek path you and I found once?" "Yes," said Stacy, "there and everywhere else." After the initial burst of cordiality, they fell silent, finding little to say to each other. How estranged they were, Stacy thought. The murmur of the children's voices and the subdued sound of Catherine's words explaining a story were comforting, to Stacy certainly, to his father almost as certainly, filling in the emptiness. Mr. Carroll called Jack to him. Jack seemed to be his favorite, and joked with the child much more naturally than he could joke with Stacy. As for Stacy, he talked with Catherine and Carter. After a while, Catherine announced to the boys that it was 5:30, and they must go wash and get ready for dinner. "Look here, Catherine," remarked Mr. Carroll, "do let them eat with us tonight." "Yes, oh yes, Mother," they cried in unison. She shook her head. "No," she said to them, "do as Mother says." And they went out slowly. "No, please," she replied to Mr. Carroll. "It's awfully good of you, but I'm sure it's better this way." Mr. Carroll frowned. "Idea of Catherine's," he said, appealing to his son. "Boys must eat at 6, an hour ahead of us. I'd like to have them at table with me. Can't you do anything about it?" Catherine was shy but firm. "I'd rather they wouldn't, please," she said. Stacy laughed. "Lord, no, I can't do anything about it," he returned. "You have my full moral support, but what's the use? Catherine's the Rock of Gibraltar." His father laughed with him and spread out his hands in surrender. Perhaps he rather liked being successfully opposed. At any rate, there was less constraint between him and Stacy after this. If in no other way, Stacy thought, they could at least be united in a league of men against women. When Catherine went down to sit at table while her sons ate, the two men talked quite freely, though chiefly of her. "You don't mind my asking her and the boys to come over here?" Mr. Carroll asked apologetically. Stacy was touched. "Good heavens, no!" he exclaimed. "It's jolly for us and better for them. It's awfully good of you, sir." "No, no," said his father gruffly. "Purely selfish. Brightens the house up. Long time since there were children here. You and Julie would grow up, confound you," he added wrathfully. Stacy laughed a little at this. "Couldn't help it, Dad," he replied. "I regret it as much as you do." "Fine girl, Catherine," Mr. Carroll went on after a moment. "I like her honesty and lack of nonsense. Some women would have refused to come because damned impertinent people might talk. They will, I suppose, having the kind of minds they've got." Stacy opened his eyes wide. "I never thought of that," he said. "But I should say," he added, "if they do, why, let them." Mr. Carroll nodded emphatically. "Let them," he assented. So Stacy and his father were also incongruously united in a revolutionary league against society. "But do you know what Catherine does, confound her?" Mr. Carroll added. "Insists on paying me the same amount as it cost her to live in that other house. Says she won't stay otherwise." He laughed half admiringly, half in exasperation. Stacy enjoyed himself in a mixed way at dinner. Indeed, he was never really bored. He had loved life once and hated it later. Indifference was impossible to him, however much his attitude toward things altered. He looked across the table at Catherine, studying her firm, grave face, over which her grief had lowered an intangible something like a veil, an expression of reserve, sweetness, and knowledge. At bottom, Stacy was rather afraid of Catherine, and while conversation ran on well enough, he studied his father's face too. What an odd trio they made, he thought, and he noted that his father's expression was stern to harshness when Mr. Carroll talked of general subjects such as the present Democratic administration or Article 10 of the League of Nations, but softened when he spoke to Stacy or Catherine of individual things or people. Just at present he was talking about the state of the whole country, and, as the subject was especially large, he looked especially fierce, his white eyebrows meeting in a frown above his fine nose. "The country's had enough of Wilson and his policies," he was saying. "You can go way back to his action in knuckling down to the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers if you want to get at the start of the whole trouble. A toady, a trimmer, a schoolmaster. Yes, sir. The world has taken Wilson's measure pretty well by now." Mr. Carroll drank a swallow of claret, then set his glass down with a bump. "Then the armistice," he burst out again. "Look at that. All Wilson with his idiotic 14 points and his peace without victory. There we had the Germans on the run. 2 weeks' time, a month, and our boys and the Allies would have marched into Berlin, and then we'd have known who won the war." Mr. Carroll did not stop here by any means. He continued, sweeping along like a surf rider on the flood of his indictments. But Stacy lost track. He remembered, as something out of a dim, different past, that he had countered this same argument in regard to the armistice at dinner that first night of his return, and that he had then apparently convinced his father. However, this awakened no antagonism in Stacy. He merely felt amused. Somehow, in some way not yet clear to himself, he had most certainly changed. He was recalled to the present by the vigor with which his father pronounced the word Bolshevism. "That's the whole trouble, Bolshevism. The country's rotten with it, and will be until we get a sane business administration and put labor and radicalism in their place." Mr. Carroll was carving a chicken at the time. He scorned effeminate households where the carving was done in the butler's pantry, and he thrust the fork deep down across the breastbone of the chicken as though he were impaling Lenin, Gompers, Haywood, and Daniels all at once. But a moment later, and quite instinctively, he laid the liver and the heart beside a drumstick on Stacy's plate, and at this Stacy was touched, for he knew that, like himself, his father had retained a boyish love of the giblets. Often he had seen his father on looking through the ice box of a Sunday night turn around and hold out with a triumphant smile a plate of chicken where reposed, brown, crisp, and indigestible, a cold gizzard and perhaps a heart. "So, I think you are very likely right, sir," said Stacy. As a matter of fact, it cost him little to say this, for he found himself quite without interest in Bolshevism, the labor problem, or the democratic maladministration. As for Mr. Carroll, he gave his son a pleased, rather surprised smile, and presently dropped all problems. But Catherine looked across at Stacy with a strange, startled expression. After dinner they went into the library and Catherine poured coffee. "I wish, Catherine," Stacy exclaimed, with a touch of exasperation, that you wouldn't glance at me in such a confoundedly apprehensive way, as though you were afraid I might object to your pouring coffee here. I like it. How many times must I tell you?" "Very well, Stacy, I'll try to be bold," she replied, a faint smile relieving the gravity of her face. Mr. Carroll laughed approvingly. "You're going to be a great help to me, son," he said. But Parker came in to tell Mr. Carroll that long distance was calling him on the phone. So Stacy and Catherine were left by themselves for a few minutes. Anyone not knowing my father well might think, to hear him talk of Bolshevism and labor, that he was harsh, Stacy observed. He's not even bigoted, really." "Oh, I'm sure he's not," Catherine exclaimed. "He's the kindest man I've ever known." "Yes, you see, partly it's because he himself has worked all his life like 3 ordinary men and, conceding the system, has made his fortune honestly. It isn't merely that he wants to hold what he's acquired. It's rather that unconsciously he feels any attack on the system as an attack on his own integrity." Stacy paused, with a frown. "It's something even more than that," he continued slowly. "If a man has all his life played the game vigorously and loyally, according to the rules, he doesn't at 61 want to be told that the rules were all wrong. That would be knocking everything from under him. Father has to believe that what is right, or where would he be? Right and wrong mean a great deal to him. He's old-fashioned in that. And then, I must say, it is a slovenly world at present for a man with clean-cut ideas to look out on. A bedraggled, tattered place, with cocky young chaps sitting in literary offices and blithely announcing every week that something else is wrong with things in general. Not that there isn't enough that's wrong, but the more truth that's told about it, the better. But a lot of the complaining is either whining or just rotten cleverness. Fancy being clever about a cyclone, or the Judgment Day." He paused and lit a cigarette. "Father's an out-and-out idealist," Stacy concluded. "He's got to believe passionately in something, and he's too old to believe in something new. Besides, nothing new is clearly presented to one." "Yes," Catherine said, "that is very clear and fair, Stacy." But the look that her dark eyes gave him was full of perplexity. "Oh," he observed lightly, "I know. You think I'm a reformed character. Not a bit of it. Nothing of me that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange." He laughed ironically. And Catherine was much too shy, as he knew she would be, to pursue the subject. When later he went upstairs, he stood for a long time before the open window of his study. "It can't be done," he said to himself at last. "You can't look at the world as a whole and stay sane. Because there isn't any such world. That's a nightmare of ogre words. Bolshevism, labor problem, greed, reaction, they're merely words. All that there truly is a lot of puny little men like myself, dreaming dreams, mostly bad ones." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Lonely Warrior by Claude C. Washburn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. At 9 the next morning, Stacy drove downtown with his father. Perhaps no real intimacy was possible between them, since they had hardly a thought or a belief in common. But they were, simply through a heightened mutual friendliness, closer together than they had been for 6 years. Stacy went up to his father's pleasant office and watched Mr. Carroll sit down in his swivel chair, light a cigar, and open his letters with a paper knife. Stacy smiled. "I've sometimes wondered, sir," he said, "why at 60 or thereabouts you—" Here, stop it," Mr. Carroll interrupted ruefully. "Well, anyway, I've wondered why you didn't retire and just amuse yourself, since you've certainly earned a rest. But—" "Retire? Nonsense! Work. That's all a man's good for. Got to stay in harness. Soon as he gets out of it, he goes to pieces." Said Stacy banteringly. "That's the theory, of course. But just look around you. Here you come down to a bright jolly office entirely cut off from the home, and open nice crisp new letters, and call in, presently, when I stop bothering you, a fresh clean stenographer, and you watch the blue smoke of a good cigar curl up across the sunlight. No, sir, you can't fool me with any talk about duty and the rest. Poetry, sheer poetry, men's ingenious little romance." Mr. Carroll leaned back in his chair and laughed. "American businessmen, why, they're our real leisure class," Stacy concluded. But at this his father protested. "I worked 10 hours a day, and sometimes 12, hard, from the time I was 18 till past 40, he observed soberly. "I know you did, sir," Stacy assented respectfully. "I'm not talking about that epoch, but about our own. The young businessmen I know, and I don't mean the clerks, people working on a salary, but the men who will be rich one day from business. How about them? They get down to their offices anywhere from 9:30 to 10, and they waste a good half hour before they begin to work, and they play a lot even when they think they're working. Then they take an hour and a half off at the club for lunch. At 4 or thereabouts, weather permitting, they motor out to the country club and play 9 holes of golf. Then they go back to a nice, different, clean house, with all the housekeeping tended to by their pretty wives. Oh, it's a hard life." "You're right," the older man growled. "It's a damned lazy life, and I don't know what the country's coming to if it keeps on." "Now really," Stacy suggested, "can you blame a laboring man if he kicks?" But at this Mr. Carroll's mouth shut in a tight line. "I'm against loafing anywhere in any class," he said sternly. "The laborer's got his job and he loafs on it. The young businessman has his and he loafs. I disapprove of both." "Yes," Stacy returned mildly, "but the results are so disproportionate. The young business idler has a far more luxurious time than the most conscientious laborer could have." But on a point like this, Mr. Carroll would never yield an inch. "Labor is getting a bigger reward for less work than it ever got before," he said. Then he changed the subject. "You know, son," he remarked, with a sudden smile, "to see you sitting there brings back so many things. I can't get over the feeling that you're a boy, as you used to be, and have come up and made yourself agreeable in preparation for touching me for money. You don't need money, do you?" he asked wistfully. "Goodness, no," said Stacy, who had just $10 to last the rest of the month. He would have liked to oblige his father, but he really couldn't in this. He got up to go, and Mr. Carroll touched the button that would summon his stenographer. "I'll run along now and leave you in peace," Stacy observed. "I'm going down to see if Parkins will give me a job." At this Mr. Carroll lifted his head quickly and gave him a sharp look. "Just a minute, Ruth," he said to the young woman who had opened the door. "I'll ring for you again presently." She went out. Mr. Carroll gazed at his son with interest. "Going back to work, eh?" "Yes." "Look here," said the older man sharply. "How would you like a job with me? Lots of big things you could work into." Stacy hesitated. He would have done a great deal to please his father, but after a moment he shook his head. "No, sir," he replied reluctantly. "I'd like it, honestly I would. It would be a fascinating new game. But architecture is the one thing I know about. You gave me years of study in it. I'd better stick to it." His father nodded. "Right," he said. "I can see that." A few minutes later, Stacy opened the door of Mr. Parkins' private office. "Hello," he remarked. "Can I come in?" "Well, Stacy," cried the architect cordially. "How are you? First rate. Got a job for me?" Mr. Parkins stared at him with a humorous smile. "Now what have you gone and done? Reformed?" Stacy laughed. "Not so far as I know," he said lightly. Then you must have acquired grace." Stacy waved the suggestion aside deprecatingly. "No," he said, "but I'll tell you the truth. I've worried my head too long about the problems of the universe. Everybody's doing it. A mistake. Work's all there is for a man, not as a drug, but just because it's the only thing he knows about and can take hold of." And Stacy had not equivocated. As far as it went, this did seem truth to him. Just a fragment of the truth. "How about that job?" he added. "Sure, glad to have you. We need you badly. Hadn't found anyone to replace poor Phil Blair. My offer's still open." "No," said Stacy, suddenly grave at the mention of Phil. "Take me on for a couple of months at the old salary. Then if I'm any good you can repeat your offer if you want to. I may have forgotten everything I knew. Tell me," he added, suddenly feeling all this as of very little importance, "how did Phil do? Tell me about Phil." "The most lovable chap I've ever known," said Mr. Parkins soberly. "And he worked very hard, too hard. I could have cried when I heard he was dead. But he wasn't the best man for the place. You would have been better. Odd, that power in anyone so frail. I felt as though I were hiring Bramante to design bathtubs." Stacy nodded. The architect smiled suddenly. "I didn't mean what I said to sound uncomplimentary to you," he added. "Oh," Stacy said impatiently, "I never thought of that. I'll be down ready to work at 9 tomorrow morning. Goodbye." And he left the office abruptly. When he was again on the street, he hesitated for a moment, then set off on foot for his sister's house 2 miles distant. But the mention of Phil's name had thrown him into so deep a preoccupation that he walked mechanically, hardly aware of his surroundings, and did not even notice the greetings people waved at him from passing motor cars. He had neglected Phil for chimeras, he mused sadly. When you thought about life as a whole it was horrible, and dead, a cold motionless monster that froze your veins. Real life, good or bad, wretched or happy, but warm, was in personal relationships, and nowhere else. He had let veil after grey veil of bleak abstractions descend between himself and Phil, obscuring this warmest and freshest of realities. And now Phil was dead. So Stacy meditated, but without bitterness, for there was a kind of fatalism upon him. Whatever was, was. Well, there was still Catherine. Perhaps he could make it up to her a little. But when at last he mounted the steps of his sister's house, his melancholy fled, for he was genuinely eager to see Julie, and was glad when the maid told him she was at home, out in the garden behind the house, he learned, and made haste to join her. "Well, Stace," she cried joyfully at sight of him, and threw her arms around him in a warm hug, taking care to keep her gloved hands, which were muddy with weeding, from touching his coat, and laughing because of doing so. "I am glad to see you. I only heard this morning. If I'd known last night, we'd have been around to the house. Why didn't you call me up? How fit you're looking." And she drew away to gaze at him, while he dropped down upon a bench and looked back smiling at her. She was plump and sweet-natured, Stacy thought, and in the bright May sunlight her complexion showed, undamaged, that clear healthy freshness which can be retained only by decent living. He was glad to be with her. "Jimmy and Junior both well?" he asked. "Splendid. Jimmy's getting rather fat and well, you see. So we're both dieting. We sit with a book propped up in front of us and count the calories and everything." She laughed and sat down beside her brother. "Too much happiness," said Stacy. "Not enough conflict. You and Jimmy ought to fight more." He was wondering about his sister. Could it really be that she encountered no problems at all? There was a sweetness and a sureness about her that made him doubt such an obvious hypothesis. "I'll stay to lunch, Jewel, if you'll ask me," he began, "because—" "Of course I will. How nice," she interrupted. "Because it will be my only chance for a while. I'm going back to work with Parkins tomorrow." "Oh, I'm glad," she exclaimed. "Are you? Why?" She looked at him rather shyly, frowning a little. "Because," she said after just an instant, "you have so fine a training, it seems a shame to waste it and let houses be built more clumsily by people who haven't had it." Stacy felt grateful for her reply. She might have said, "Because I think you'll be happier," or "Because I think every man ought to do something." She had their father's direct way of going straight to the heart of a question, and she was so simple about it that she got no credit for intelligence. What she said always sounded usual. She went on with her reading now, and they talked cordially of superficial things. Junior, back from kindergarten, made himself the center of conversation during lunch, but afterward Julie sent him away with his nurse and sat down with Stacy in the living room. It was curious, he thought, what a sense of intimacy he felt, since, except for that one remark of hers, they had talked only of externals. "Julie," he demanded abruptly, "does everything really run along for you as smoothly as it seems to? Are you truly perfectly happy?" She gave him a startled look, her eyes suddenly troubled. "No," she said painfully after a long moment, "I'm not so bovine as all that. Oh," she added quickly, "I get along. I haven't any soul tragedies, and I'm not in love with some other man than Jimmy. But there are things," she pressed her fingers together nervously, "different things, that I'd like to do, or feel. Reckless things." Looking into her flushed face, Stacy perceived a strange, unknown Julie, and he, too, was troubled and remorseful. "I didn't know," he said. "You never tried to find out, did you, Stacy dear?" she replied gently. "No," he assented. "But why should you?" she asked, defending him against her own attack. "Everyone's the same way. They all think, 'Oh, Julie, just the typical housewife.'" "The more fools they," Stacy muttered. "No, it's natural. I behave that way. I have to behave some way." "It's a lot to your credit. The world would be smoother if everyone did. Don't be cross with me for stirring you up, Jewel. It wasn't nasty or meant to be. I was only interested." She gave him a warm smile. "Of course I'm not cross. I think it was nice of you," she said, quite her everyday self again. But perhaps it was because of what he had said that she ventured, a little later, to bring up another subject. "Stacy," she began, rather hesitantly, "I think what father has done in asking Catherine to stay at the house is splendid, and I'm truly glad about it. I love Catherine, but I thought perhaps you ought to know that some people are gossiping about it." "Are they?" he remarked. "We thought, father and I, that they probably would." Julie looked relieved. "Then that's all right," she observed. "It was only on Catherine's account that I was disturbed." "Catherine would mind even less than we." Julie nodded. "And of course," she went on, "they don't dare say anything really nasty, only small catty things." She paused for a moment, looking at her brother. "Do you know who it was that started such talk?" she added suddenly. "Marion Price." Stacy's brow contracted. "Marion?" he repeated slowly. "What kind of things did Marion say?" His sister's face was hard. "Oh, that it was all a scheme of Catherine's to catch you, and that you were so susceptible she'd undoubtedly succeed." Stacy experienced a sudden sick disgust, but the feeling vanished presently. "Poor Marion," he said. "Poor Marion?" Julie cried. "Why, I'd like to know. Hasn't she got what she wanted?" "No, because she doesn't know what she wants," Stacy returned slowly. "She wants so many different conflicting things, and she doesn't know what any of them are. Marion's wretched." But Julie's eyes were cold. "Anyhow, you've been away this winter, so you don't know all that I do about Marion. I'm afraid she's a bad lot." Stacy winced. "No," he replied, though kindly enough. "You're not afraid of that, Julie. You'd rather have it so." His sister rose quickly and came over to sit beside him on the davenport. "Yes," she admitted contritely, "that was nasty of me. But I can't like Marion. I never could." She gazed at her brother timidly. "Stace," she said, her face flushing, "are you still in love with Marion?" She appeared rather frightened at her own daring. "No," he replied simply, looking straight into his sister's eyes. "No, not any more. Not the least bit." Julie drew a deep breath. "Then you may be as sorry for her as you like," she said happily. The rest of their talk was matter of fact and trivial enough. But when Stacy got up to go, Julie accompanied him to the door. She seemed all at once a little uneasy. "Stacy," she remarked, not looking at him, and playing with a button of his coat, "please don't think from anything I said that I'm not decently happy. I am, of course I am. It sounds ungrateful. No one could be sweeter than Jimmy, and then there's Junior. Her brother laughed. "Don't be a silly, Jewel," he interrupted. "I understood perfectly well what you meant. That, in spite of everything, you did have some thwarted desires. So has Jimmy, no doubt. So has everyone. It's just as well, I dare say. There's been less thwarting than normally going on these last few years. The lid's been lifted a little. And look at the hellish mess. Good-bye. Thanks a lot. I had a lovely time." As he walked away, he meditated about Marion. How she hated him. Oh, not because he had broken their engagement. In the end, she had seen eye to eye with him about that, acquiescing cynically in his second estimate of her, which, he knew now, had been as false as his first. She was angry because he had not come to her house that winter night. He pictured vividly how she must have looked, what she must have felt, while she sat there waiting and waiting, till at last, white and still with fury, she went up to bed. She had offered him all that she thought she had to give, and he had accepted, then changed his mind. Consciously superior in morals, she must have thought him. He hadn't been, heaven knew. No wonder she hated him. He had no passion left for Marion. At least, there was none in the thought of her. There was no telling what her physical presence might stir up in him. But he felt a bruised tenderness for her, and sorrow that she should be so wretched. He had loved her alone. After a while he came to the park, and there, sitting on the same bench from which she had called to him that afternoon when Stacy had broken his engagement to Marion, he found Mrs. Latimer. But now he saw her first, and stood quite near to her for a full half-minute before she caught sight of him. Now, as then, she was poking holes in the gravel with the point of a parasol, but she did not seem the same, he thought. Her pose was tired, and the droop of her shoulders. When she became aware of someone's close presence, and looked up, he was shocked. She appeared so old and worn. Then her face flashed into glad recognition, and the impression lost its acuteness. "Why, Stacy," she exclaimed, "did you drop from the sky?" She moved over to make room for him on the bench, and he sat down. "It's just about a year ago, not quite," he returned, "that I found you here in the same place. Only then you had to call me. This time it's I who's surprised you. I'm awfully glad to see you, Mrs. Latimer. I was coming to your house presently." "And you got back—" "Yesterday." She gazed at him with affectionate curiosity. And now her familiar smile and bearing, all her known quality, was as a lack of focus in a lens, blurring the objective. Yet, even so, he still felt that she was somehow changed, older, less resilient. "You look very strong and composed and sure of yourself," she said at last. "Do I? Well, that's good," he returned lightly. She let it go at that, tactfully, and they talked of outside things, of his life in Pickens, of Vernon, of how lovely the month was. About herself Mrs. Latimer said nothing at all, And this worried Stacy until it occurred to him that she had never talked of herself, save only, suddenly, on that one afternoon a year ago here in the park. "You must come home with me now," she observed after a while, "and I will give you tea." And she got up rather wearily. Her drawing-room was just as he remembered it. The light gleamed in just the same way from the ivory woodwork and along the polished surfaces of the same exquisite vases. But the room seemed to Stacy like a deadened melody played on muted strings. It was a romantic room, and it needed Marian, the old elfish Marian, slipping in and out lightly, to vivify it. He looked around him dreamily. Mrs. Latimer had sunk down on a divan and removed her hat slowly. Now she was leaning back and looking at Stacy, not so much curiously as wistfully. "It's very good to have you here, Stacy," she said at last simply. "Thank you," he replied, warmed by her affection, and feeling soothed by the delicate hushed beauty of the room, which had no connection with the outside world. The maid brought in the tea things. But the water had been boiling in the silver urn for some little time before Mrs. Latimer finally made the tea. It seemed to demand a conscious effort for her to lift her hand to the urn. "You're tired," said Stacy suddenly. "Aren't you feeling well?" She started, so that some of the water spilled over upon the tray. For just a moment she gave him an odd, pained look. Then she turned about quickly and laid her head against the back of the divan. Her shoulders shook with sobs, and there was a fatigue without relaxation in every line of her taut body. Stacy was shocked. He had always thought of Mrs. Latimer as strong, cool, and too wise to be shaken by any tempest. He had no idea of what to do or say. Instinctively he desired to stand near her and comfort her, but he feared that this would only make things worse. So he sat silent and gazed upon her pityingly. After a while she looked up. "Forgive me," she began. Then at sight of his expression her mouth trembled, and she cried again. But presently she regained control of herself and wiped her eyes. Then Stacy saw that she was an old woman with a weary, tragic face. "I beg your pardon, Stacy," she murmured unsteadily. "What is it?" he asked gently. "Nothing. I just can't go on with it." "Tell me." She was silent for a moment. "It was only because you were kind, Stacy, and seemed to feel interest in me." She did not mean this as a reproof, he knew. But he was aware that it was a damning one. Her interest in him had always been immense and generous. What interest had he ever shown in her? He had taken her for granted. "Tell me," he repeated. "But there are so many things one doesn't say, one isn't allowed. If I told the truth I should seem shameful, violating decency." Her eyes were chilly now and questioning. He shook his head. "Well then," she said suddenly, in a hard voice, "it's my husband, or partly. Perhaps he finds me as faulty as I find him, but oh, he's finely greedy, finely futile, finely avaricious, finely sterile in every human sentiment. I could bear all those things, perhaps, but for his fineness in all of them. I can't live with him any longer. I loathe him. What have I done with my life, Stacy? I look down on nothing but ruins. My only child does not love me, nor I her. What good to bear a child? What is such a life for? I've been tolerant too long. What's it all about, life?" "Don't," he said quickly. "You can't do it that way. I know." His tone calmed her and she looked at him in a pathetic questioning manner, as though she, who had always been like a watchful mother to him, were now his child. He sincerely did not like to talk about himself. He would always have an almost fierce aloofness. But he would give Mrs. Latimer what he could, if there was anything to give. "See," he said, life is a Medusa. Try to face it, and it freezes you to stone. You must look at the mirrored reflection in yourself. in the shield of your own personality. Then you can see it without horror for the pitiful, snake-crowned, impotently ugly thing it is." He paused, with an odd smile. "You even," he added slowly, "can see a ravaged beauty in it." Mrs. Latimer stared at him in silence, but the tensity in her face had vanished, perhaps because she was surprised. "And the sword? Perseus' sword?" she asked finally. "No," he said, "that's as far as the analogy goes. There is no sword." She gazed at him with a gentle, eager look, and he saw that he really had helped her, not probably through anything he had said, but by awakening her capacity for sympathetic interest in others, her deep altruism. It was of him she was thinking now, proudly, as though he were herself. And, much as he disliked to, he would have gone on and told her everything he knew about himself if she had asked it. But she seemed to divine the effort he had made, and asked him nothing further. "Oh," she cried after a moment, with a tremulous laugh, "your tea, Stacy." "I like it cold, thanks," he said, also laughing. And after this they managed to talk almost easily of common things. But, having risen to draw a curtain at a window, Mrs. Latimer suddenly turned about. "Stacy, you must go now," she exclaimed. "I have just seen my husband coming up the street. I couldn't bear to have you here in the room with both of us after what I said. I exaggerated. It isn't as bad as all that. I shall be all right." He held out his hand to say good-bye, but she leaned forward and kissed his cheek. "Thank you," she said. After he left the house, Stacy met Mr. Latimer. He looked like a steel engraving of a gentleman. "Ah, you're just going?" he remarked, with his cool, polished smile. "Sorry," said Stacy, "I must." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Lonely Warrior by Claude Washburn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Stacy threw himself into work with a cold vigor that had in it nothing of fad or impulse. He did not find, as he had feared he might, that he had forgotten much. Everything came back to him at once. It had all been there, tucked away, neglected, within him. Neither did he chafe at the long regular hours he kept, nor feel them burdensome. In the old days he had perhaps been a little lazy. It had been hard for him, on arriving at the office, not to waste time, over a newspaper or a book catalogue, or anything that presented itself, before actually beginning his work. He had crept into work as a swimmer into cold water. Now there was no indolence about him. The instant he sat down at his desk, he turned his mind on the problems before him. And swiftly, intelligently, with intense concentration, he was soon accomplishing twice as much as any other man in the office. Indeed, less from a desire to be always busy than from a kind of impatient thoroughness, dislike of slovenliness, he often spent hours on drawings that he might have turned over to draftsmen. But, though he was extremely interested in his work, there was no such zest in it for him as he had once felt. Formerly he had romanticized it, had seen it all as something glowing and fine. Now it was only rarely that he experienced a little lifting sense of loveliness. This was when loveliness was really there to perceive. Mr. Parkins, who was something of a dreamer and himself inclined to waste time, was amazed. He had difficulty in supplying Stacy with enough to do. "Look here," he said, before Stacy had been back a month. "What the devil's come over you? You're insatiable. You turn the work out as though it were arithmetic," and he smiled in his uncertain, reflective way. "So it is, 9/10 of it, as unemotional as arithmetic. Nothing but concentration needed most of the time. Restful, a mistake to use your soul when you don't have to." The architect sat down on the edge of Stacy's desk. "But," he suggested tentatively, "you don't feel your old delight in it, or do you?" "When there's any occasion," said Stacy. "There, for instance. and he pulled from a mass of papers a drawing of a detail, a wrought iron balcony for a window. His eyes showed pleasure. "Yes, by Jove, yes, that is good, Stacy. Fine and sure at the same time. You're better than you used to be. For Henderson's house? Pity it's so sort of wasted. I mean that it won't be appreciated." "Oh, I don't feel that," Stacy replied. "I feel that it's worthwhile enough to do anything good, even a molding for a room. I don't know why." Mr. Parkins looked surprised. "Well, that's the right way to feel, of course. There's one thing certain," he added, getting up. "You go into the firm the first of the month, and there's no favoritism about that either." "All right," said Stacy. "Thanks, it's awfully good of you." And he went to work again. What Mr. Parkins had said was true. Stacy was a better architect than formerly. He was still affectionately interested in detail, because that interest had always been a part of him, and he knew enough now to understand calmly that nothing in one ever vanished, but he saw things in a larger, more solid way than once. Hammond, a younger man who was put under Stacy's guidance, questioned him about Stacy's preliminary sketch for a competition. It was of a great stone bridge that was to cross both branches of the river in the heart of the railway and warehouse section. "Don't you think it may be a little, grim, Carol?" asked Hammond, puzzled. "Good Lord, man," said Stacy. "Think where it is. Mud, noise, confusion." "Well, that's just it. Oughtn't one to brighten the place up a little?" Stacy shook his head. "I'm no damned beauty doctor. Just the facts, the right ones, in the best way." Stacy played tennis hard for an hour every afternoon when he had finished work, for his strong body craved exercise. But his mind did not crave companionship. He mingled with only a few people, and most of these doubtless resented his manner as seeming hard and cold. In this they were wrong. Stacy was merely aloof. He was not superior, judging these people adversely. He was simply not letting them in, or himself into them. He had a feeling that this world of personal relationships was too rich. It was more like a sea. One might be swept away futilely on it. Toward those whom he did admit as companions, as they were sometimes the unlikeliest people, he was prodigal of interest. In his own different way, as altruistic as Mrs. Latimer. For his hasty luncheon, Stacy frequented a small cheap restaurant nearby. So also did Jack Edwards, who had been commander of the local American Legion post at the time Stacy had set it in a turmoil, but was so no longer, having been succeeded by someone less incongruously radical. The two fell into the habit of sitting down at table together for their 15-minute meal, and Stacy found himself at once attracted by the other man. Something in his firm, lined face, perhaps the odd expression of the brown eyes, hinted at a tortured, courageous personality. Stacy was friendly from the first. Edwards, on the other hand, was in the beginning obviously suspicious. But he thawed gradually, and the two became friends, united by some deep, almost unrecognized resemblance between them. Yet for a long time their talk was hardly more than casual comment on events. "What do you do after lunch?" asked Stacy one June day, as they pushed back their chairs and rose. "You must surely take more time off than this before going back to work." "Oh," the other replied, "I generally stroll around for 20 minutes, down to the river sometimes." "Come up to my office and smoke a cigarette, won't you? There'll be no one there for half an hour yet." "Don't care if I do." And the two men paid their checks and went out together, Stacy walking slowly, since Edwards limped badly on account of his wounded leg. In Stacy's room they sat down, with the littered desk between them, and smoked silently for some minutes. Stacy had his feet up against the side of an open drawer, but suddenly he swung them down and turned to face his friend. "Edwards," he demanded abruptly, "what do you think of the war, anyway?" The muscles of the other man's rather stern face contracted slightly. "Think of it?" he returned. "I don't think of it. I don't want to. Once in a while I dream." Stacy considered him with grim comprehension. From almost anyone else, the remark would have sounded melodramatic. Edwards made it quite sincerely, with no thought of effect. When the raw black and white stuff of melodrama became truth, that was horrible. Stacy shivered, but after a little he returned to it. "Yes, but I mean, do you feel now that it was all bad, all rotten, selfish commercialism from the very beginning? Oh, you've every right to. I don't blame you and your people if you do. But do you?" "We've been tricked," Edwards replied bitterly, "duped, and I'll take that point of view, the one you ask me if I have, publicly as long as I live. It's the only way for me and mine to fight you and yours. Just as the way for your side to fight is to assert that the war was noble. But it's not so simple. No, I don't think that." "No more do I," cried Stacy. "I hate the war. It brought out everything rotten that lay hidden in men. But some hundreds of thousands of young men did go into it nobly, and to just that extent it was a decent war. They're mostly dead now, worse luck to the world, and a good many of those that aren't are turned beastly by what they lived through. But," he paused, a kind of dark light smoldered in his eyes. "There was courage," said Edwards in a deep voice. "My God, there was courage. Not your romantic high adventure sort, but the sort that could live through mud and intensive shelling and still push men on, afterward, to advance. But, oh Christ, the wasted lives in the Argonne, thrown away through sheer incompetence. Your people did that." "And even so," said Stacy somberly, "you didn't see the Somme." Suddenly the dull glow in his eyes rose to a flame. He struck the desk with his clenched fist. "The thing that gets me, Edwards," he burst out, "is these beastly cheap editors of weeklies sitting up and writing pertly about the war as if it had been all a game of grab, nothing decent. Damn them! Petty complacent asses. What do they know about it? What do they know about physical courage, or any other kind? Have they suffered? Have they fought for ideals and been given dung? The intellectuals, they call themselves. An honest protester like Debs, all right, I'll respect him. But these vulgar underbred egotists, faugh. The only ones I hate as much are the others who sit up and write about how everything was first rate, bully war, noble, good clearly coming out of it." He ceased, panting with rage. "Don't hate so, Carol," said Edwards slowly. "Where's the good?" Stacy drew his hand across his forehead. "You're right," he returned. "It's idiotic. I thought I'd learned better. And," he added, laughing shortly, "fancy wasting emotion on that tribe." He felt dizzy and faintly nauseated, as though poisoned, and he was rather ashamed. It was a flash out of an earlier side of him. For Stacy was like a fabric that was being woven together steadily out of various strands. But here and there the woof was faulty, the pattern was broken, threads stuck out loosely. But moments of hate such as this were rare. Generally he was cool enough, cooler and perhaps more tolerant than Edwards, who always in general talk showed himself bitterly conscious of the class struggle. Edwards came up to the office for a few minutes after luncheon nearly every day now, and as long as the two men talked personally or of concrete subjects, he forgot his obsession, or rather, seemed almost irately unable to apply it in any way to Stacy. But at the least broadening of the conversation, it emerged, a sullen thing. "Come out to dinner with us some evening, will you? Tonight, if you like," Stacy suggested once. "No," said Edwards shortly. Stacy laughed. "Why not? Bound to have no dealings with the devil or any of his allies? Better come. You'd like my father. You'd fight with him, but you'd like him." "I don't want to," said Edwards. "I don't want to like any of your crew. It's their likableness that I resent. Of course they're likable. Why shouldn't they be? They've leisure and all the appurtenances essential to becoming so. We've got to fight them, you, as class against class." "I see," Sentiment must be kept out. No fraternizing in the trenches. Edwards flushed. "You're too rotten clever, Carol," he replied resentfully. "It's easy for you to make me appear in the wrong." "No," said Stacy. "I simply fancy you're wrong to think in classes. They're abstractions. If everybody would drop them, men could meet as men." "Oh," exclaimed Edwards, clearly out of patience. "It's all very well for you to sit there and talk. You can afford to be sweetly reasonable. You're fixed, safe. You've everything. Of course you can talk unselfishly. You can even talk like a revolutionary. You know damned well there isn't going to be any revolution. Not yet." "Well, as for that," said Stacy mildly, "I'll admit that I live in a luxurious house with all sorts of comforts. Pleasant enough in their way. Only how much do they amount to? I'm not essentially soft. I go inhabiting the place because it's there, because I haven't any particular social theories. I don't, for instance, see what good my not living there would do anyone. Because of my father, and because of Catherine Blair, my friend Phil's widow, and her boys." Edward's face was crimson. "I didn't mean what I said, Carol," he blurted out. "I know well enough that. Oh, well, I apologize." "Shucks," said Stacy. "That's all right. It's a good thing to look into one's own existence now and then. For the rest, I dare say that I'm paid more than I'm worth for my work here. I can't tell, and I don't intend to waste much time worrying about it. I probably earn more than a skilled mechanic like you, and that's wrong. I earn less than a broker, and that's wrong. I can, because of my aptitude and a long training, build decent houses. How's anyone to know what my exact remuneration should be? Under this system, the Lord God himself couldn't decide." "That's what I mean. Under this system." Stacy was engrossed with the plans for the bridge one afternoon when the office boy poked his head in at the door. "Lady to see you, Mr. Carroll," he announced. "All right," said Stacy mechanically, not taking it in. So when a moment later he looked up to see Irene Loeffler standing opposite him, he fairly gaped with surprise. But he rose quickly and went around the desk to her. "How are you?" he said. "I didn't hear you come in. Sit down, do. It's a long time since I've seen you." She shook hands, dropped his hand quickly, then flung herself into a chair. She was the same abrupt, disconcerting person as ever. Just now she was a trifle flushed with embarrassment. Stacy sat down near her, but not too near, and considered her with a polite external gravity. Inwardly he was amused by the recollection of her advances, somewhat remorseful at having treated her so roughly, and just a little apprehensive. "Wanted to see you, Mr. Carroll," Irene began gruffly. "And this seemed a good place. Sorry to disturb you, though." But there was a faint tremor in her voice. Her affectation of mannishness made her appear only the more feminine, Stacy thought. In an odd way she was attractive. "Not a bit of it. I'm glad to see you," he replied and waited. Irene swallowed once or twice. "Well," she said, trying again for a beginning, "I wanted to tell you something. I suppose you've got a rotten opinion of me, haven't you?" she demanded, staring at him, a sulky, childish look about her mouth. Stacy cordially disclaimed having anything of the sort. "Well, you'd have a right to, I guess. Anyway, what I wanted to tell you was that I've come to my senses. You haven't anything to fear from me any more." Stacy choked at this and kept his face straight with difficulty. "And I'm engaged to be married to Paul Hemingway. Know him?" "Fine," said Stacy, laughing in spite of his best efforts. "Awfully good fellow. I think you've chosen well. I'll send you a wedding present." And he held out his hand. But she did not take it. Instead, she twisted her handkerchief nervously around her fingers. Stacy had never seen anyone with so little repose. "Do you think," she demanded abruptly, "that it's all right for me to marry him?" He stared at her. "Why, what do you mean?" he asked, completely lost. "Well, I mean, she said sullenly, her lower lip quivering like that of a child about to cry, I mean, after what I said to you. Stacy understood now and was touched. Why, you silly child, he exclaimed. I never heard anything so absurd. If that's the worst thing you ever did, you've the purest past in the world. She brightened, tears of relief standing in her eyes. But anyway, I must tell Paul about it, mustn't I? No, Stacy almost shouted, overcome with a mixture of amazement and admiration. There's nothing to tell. Irene wiped her eyes in obvious resentment at the need. All right then, she said. Thanks. And now she shook hands. Then she looked at Stacy with a tremulous smile. You've got a lot of charm, she announced. But at this he retreated hastily behind his desk, and she departed laughing. Stacy thought often of Marion, but he did not see her until July. He had left the office late one afternoon and was walking briskly along the boulevard on the way to the tennis courts when she called to him from her open car. It drew up at the curb beside him, and Marion reached out her hand to him gracefully. She was coming from a tea, she said, and she was wearing a lacy dress of blue and silver and a drooping picture hat, white and transparent, that cast soft shadow over her face without really obscuring it. Against the deep cushions of the tonneau she looked small, elegant, and sophisticated. It occurred to Stacy that it was nonsense for him to be concerned about her. Their meeting must have appeared to an outsider like one of those salon pictures of an encounter in the Bois de Boulogne. You're looking very well, Stacy, she said gaily, but you don't deserve to have me say so. Have you been back for 2 months without coming near me? It's not respectful. Stacy laughed. What a funny word. Well, I will come. Love to. Marion's arm hung limply along the edge of the car. She drummed idly with her hand against the polished enamel. And the gesture seemed to sum her up. Perfection, graceful ennui, and all. Oh, she said, you'll just say you'll come, and that will be the end of it unless I pin you down. So I will. Come, let's see. Come on Monday at 5 and have tea with me. All right, thanks. I'll be coming straight from the office, so I'll look dingy probably. Hope you won't mind. Gracious, no, she replied, apparently without malice, and laughing rather delightfully. It's not your clothes I care about seeing. I've got clothes. Till Monday, then. She touched the chauffeur's back lightly with the tip of her slender blue and white parasol, and the car moved away smoothly. He gazed after her for a moment, and again he dubbed himself a fussy fool. He forgot that one's thought of a person is direct, without veils, so that in an actual encounter, after a long separation, one is aware chiefly of the veils. But it was only his father and Catherine whom Stacy saw constantly. He spent nearly all his evenings at home. Sometimes he would read, or would merely look on while Catherine and Mr. Carroll played cards. And he was amused at this, for he did not think that Catherine liked cards really. When he thought she had endured enough, he would insist on playing in her stead, declaring that she was usurping his place in the home. Or again, they would all three merely sit and talk. But this made Mr. Carroll restless. He demanded, Stacy could see, some direct problem, even if a small one, to occupy his mind. He could talk while he played cards, but talk was for him no end in itself. It was a pleasant accompaniment to something else that led somewhere. On other evenings, when Mr. Carroll must speak at a banquet or welcome some visiting potentate of the Republican Party, Mr. Harding was nominated by now, and Mr. Carroll, at first disappointed, soon perceived that the choice was a wise one. Stacy would sit with Catherine, or, more often, walk with her in the garden. He felt that he did not know Catherine at all, and he was aware that this was partly his fault. He had always thought of her as Phil's wife, and she still evoked for him the memory of Phil rather than any clear image of her own. Yet, though he could not have said what she was like, he admired her more than anyone else he knew. It was no good to ask himself why. He could say vaguely that she was clear and cool as deep water, that she had a profound truthfulness, that there was a quality of fact in her. What did all that mean? Only once had her personality touched his in a flash. On that afternoon when she had pleaded with him, but commandingly almost, if gently, not to go to Marian. And he had cut her with cruel words because he had yielded. He bit his lip in shame at the thought. And she was so shy, so immensely reserved. She was not really at her ease with him, he saw, except when the boys were present or his father. She would talk about herself when Stacy questioned her, as though she were talking of someone else. "What do you do with your day, Catherine?" he asked once. "I mean, when the boys are away at school." This seemed to startle her rather. I write, or try to, regularly, Stacy," she replied after a moment. They were walking in the garden, and he paused suddenly to stare at her. "You mean things to publish?" he cried, amazed. "Yes. Does it seem incredible?" "I suppose it does," she returned simply. No, I don't mean that. I should think you probably had more to say than anyone else I know, only, pardon me, Catherine, oh well, let's be frank. Expression isn't your forte." She laughed shyly at this. "It's easier when you write," she said. "Yes, of course, it must be. What kind of things?" "Little articles," she replied haltingly. "Mostly for English papers. It's hard to get them accepted here. One or two places do, sometimes." "You'll let me see them? Please." "Never!" she exclaimed, horrified. "And I don't sign my own name, so it's useless to look." "You're exasperating, Catherine," he cried, and meant it. Then he laughed suddenly. "I'll bet they're radical. Oh, radical. Tell me, Catherine," he added maliciously, "when you've gone upstairs after my father has talked about Bolshevism at some length, do you sit down then and write your subversive stuff? A double life, that's what you're leading." She flushed at this, and would say no more. Yet Stacy's persistent attempt to get at Catherine was not the result of mere curiosity, even the curiosity of affection. At heart he felt vaguely that she was immensely lonely in her isolation, in great need of sharing her grief for Phil with someone else. He would have her make such a friend of him as Phil had made him. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Lonely Warrior by Claude Washburn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In 1910, Harriet Price, Ames's mother and widow of John Price, who had been head of the Price Tractor and Motor Company, built a new house. In 1912 she died, and the mansion, together with many other good things, among them a controlling interest in the tractor company, passed to Ames, the only child. The house, which was an immense square building of yellow stone in the Italian Renaissance style, occupied with its grounds an entire block in the best section of the fashionable boulevard. Stacy had always rather liked the exterior, though it was not Parkins and May, but a Chicago firm of architects who had built the house. It was severe, commanding, less inharmonious in Vernon than most anachronisms, and the four great chimneys were really fine. Never having cared for the prices, Stacy had seen the interior but once, at a large housewarming affair given in the winter of 1910, to which he had gone out of curiosity. It had struck him then as Chicago decorators' stuff, which it was, proper, faultlessly in period, quite without character. He remembered perfectly the dreariness of his impression. So now, when he entered the vast hall, his first glimpse of it made him aware of change. "Mr. Carroll, sir?" asked the English butler. "Will you go upstairs, please? Mrs. Price is expecting you there, sir." "Yes," said Stacy. "Half a minute." He walked quickly across the hall and stood for a moment at the entrance to the great drawing room on the left. As he looked in he smiled, half appreciatively, half ironically. Change? Well, rather. To begin with, Marian, it was Marian, of course, had swept away pretty much everything that had been in that room when Stacy had first seen it. But even supposing the discarded furniture and pictures to have been sold, he hardly thought the present relative bareness had saved Dame's money. That long table, the Florentine chest, and the copy of a relief in marble with touches of blue and gold. Desiderio da Settignano? If it was a copy, He turned back. "All right," he said to the butler, "I'll go up." As he mounted the broad stone stairway, the man following, his glance rested on a tapestry, a Medici tapestry if he knew anything about it. Phew, he thought. But his eyes were just a little hard now. Marian would take and give nothing. All the same, what did she get from it? Again, he felt suddenly unreasoningly sorry for her. The butler conducted Stacy to the south end of the upper hall, tapped perfunctorily at a door, opened it, and Stacy went in. The room he entered was a small sitting room, Marian's own, most certainly, English in feeling, crowded with a great many things. Or, rather, no, on second thought, Stacy knew it well. It was like what pleasant English people did sometimes to their smallest, best-loved room in a Tuscan villa. The French windows were wide open, but the heavy wooden shutters were closed to shut out the heat, so that only a soft summer air entered, with perfumes from the garden outside. There was a kind of radiant greenish twilight in the room. No one was there, though a flame burned beneath a silver kettle. 2 fragile cups stood ready, and a tea wagon with bread and butter and cake was drawn up near the table. After perhaps a minute, Marian entered through another door. She was wearing a simple dress of a pearl gray color, short, as the fashion was, and with a silver cord about the waist. She looked as Greek as anyone or anything modern could look, and Stacy drew in his breath sharply with admiration of her beauty. Nevertheless, as he shook hands with her and replied to her apparently natural greeting, he was wary. All this delightful readiness for his visit, the coziness, the shining tea things, Marian herself. "I mistrust the Greeks and the gifts they bring," he said to himself suddenly, and smiled, finding the quotation apt, Marian looking as she did. But he kept it to himself. Marian sat down at the table, but remained for a moment gracefully idle, smiling at him before beginning to make the tea. "You see all my preparations, Stacy," she said lightly. "You see what an event it is when you come. Aren't you flattered?" "You know I am," he returned, almost disarmed now by her remark. And this was true, for Stacy was genuinely anxious to be friends with Marian. After all, at bottom, he was a simple person. That is, he was complex only on his receptive side. He could perceive, quite without effort, the subtlest, most tangled, personal relationships all about him, whether or not he was himself involved in them. He had always been able to do this. But the real Stacy Carrol in the center of this rich, shimmering web remained simple. The impulses on which he acted were simple. Almost boyish sometimes. Marian and Stacy were both silent while she measured out the tea and poured the hot water. Gazing at her so closely, he noted that she was very thin. Her fine pointed face was almost sharp, and her bare arms, lifted prettily to the silver urn, were too slender. Stacy was sorry, but considering himself questioningly, he recognized that this half-pity for Marian, together with an artist's admiration of her loveliness, was all that he felt for her now. Absolutely all. No touch of love remained, and Stacy was immensely relieved. "It has to brew 7 minutes," said Marian, glancing at her tiny turquoise-encrusted wristwatch, then leaning back in a corner of her chair and resting her long, slim hands on one arm of it. "Most people treat tea-making so clumsily," Stacy remarked. "You make it an art, just as you do with all the other daily things. They acquire distinction. That's nice." "Thanks," she said idly, "but it's only that it tastes better if it's made right, you know." "And isn't that something?" "Marion," he added, noting that her fingers were quite bare, "don't you wear your rings any more?" She glanced down at her hands. "No," she said, "I don't like them, and they slip off." "You mustn't let yourself get so thin," he returned solicitously. She gave him a quick hard smile. "Of course not. I must keep myself a handsome objet d'art, mustn't I? I remember all about the Parthenon, Stacy." "No, no," he answered, discouraged, getting a glimpse of her antagonism. "I didn't mean that. I only meant that you must stay well. What a rotter you must think me, to take my remark like that. As far as that goes, you're more beautiful at present than I've ever seen you," he added simply. But he saw her bite her lip after her pettish outburst, and he felt lost, baffled. To save him, he could not make out what she was after, whether she regretted her spiteful little attack because it was not in line with a carefully prepared program, or because she merely wanted to be friendly and hadn't meant to grow petulant. His mind played restlessly over the whole situation and could make nothing of it. "Yes, that was rather nasty of me, I admit," said Marion after a moment. It was some little time before she could again conquer his wariness, but she did so at last. There is a smooth, disarming intimacy about the tea hour. The ceremony of tea itself is so fine. It is elegant, aloof and gracious. It ministers to taste, yet not to appetite. People are not there to chew and be nourished. And then the hour itself is lovable. The sun's rays growing level, dust in the air turned golden, a hush perceptible even through the city's noise. Stacy surrendered to the atmosphere of intimacy. He drank the fragrant China tea and talked without restraint of a number of things. Perhaps, he thought, he and Marion might still be friends. He had treated her abominably and was sorry for it now that he understood her better, though she, he admitted, understood him better than he her. They could be silent, too. Pauses were not awkward. "You gather so much fineness together, Marion," he remarked once. "All that you touch becomes fine, turns to gold." He ceased abruptly. That was the wrong allusion, he thought, annoyed at his clumsiness. But she did not seem to mind it. "You're really quite kindly toward me, aren't you, Stacy?" she remarked, with just a hint of irony in her voice, but smiling pleasantly. "Why shouldn't I be?" "No reason at all, of course," she said prettily, making him a mocking little bow. "Have some more tea." He held out his cup, watched her fill it, then set it down again, all mechanically. "People get in states of mind, for no particular reason," he said vaguely, feeling apologetic, yet not wanting to go into the matter, as much on her account as on his. "Yes, and then into others. Tell me, do you feel kindly toward everybody now?" "Oh, I shouldn't go so far as to claim that," he replied uncomfortably. It went against his whole nature to talk about himself to Marion, yet he felt he owed her some sort of confession. So he went on haltingly. "I used to get awfully worked up about a lot of things. About people being greedy, for instance. I don't mean any one person, everybody, whole human race. But then," he concluded diffidently, "it struck me that they weren't hateful on account of it, but only pathetic, since their greed never brought them happiness. Never." Marion's face was half turned away from him, and she was resting her chin in her cupped hand, an old familiar pose, so that he could not see her expression. But all at once she dropped her hand, lay back in her chair, and laughed musically, startling him. "Oh, Stacy, you're so funny," she exclaimed. "I've told you that before, but I think," she added, not laughing now, smiling at him deliberately, "that I liked you better in your fierce, world-defying, Byronic stage, when you were so dramatic, than now in this Christ-like phase." He winced sharply. She had really hurt him there. He despised people who went sweetly through the world doing good to others, which was what she meant. Stacy flushed hotly, but he caught a fleeting gleam of triumph in Marion's eyes, And at this, his anger and most of his shame left him, and he only felt drearily that it was no use. She hated him and had got him there on purpose to take this sort of small revenge. It was true that she had led him on and stabbed just when he had generously disarmed. She had not played fair. But after all, why should she? She baffled him today, though. He thought that now he was in for it, that she would try to lead him into some further trap. Instead, she grew suddenly listless, talked indifferently of casual things, or, again, talked rapidly and artificially. She made no more onslaughts, was rather kind to him than otherwise, ringing for the butler to bring up a brand of cigarettes of which she knew Stacy was fond. But he felt her to be immensely sophisticated, with no girlishness remaining. Leaning back in her chair, she had the weary perfection of something finished, complete and soulless. There was no trace left in her of the elfish charm for which he had once loved her idolatrously. Nor had there been at the very beginning of the afternoon, when she had seemed fresh and spontaneous. She went down to the door with him when he left her, but she shook hands almost apathetically. He puzzled over it as he walked homeward. He could not understand what Marian had been about. Surely she had not summoned him to give him that one thrust. She was too clever not to have been able to do more than that if revenge was what she had been after. It did not occur to him that Marian might simply have been intolerably bored, and have wanted him as some kind of relief, to cajole or stab as the mood struck her. What Stacy did feel was that it was restful to go back to Catherine and his father from so much futile complexity. Not that they were so limpid either, come to think about it. Catherine especially wasn't, but they were direct. The interview left him feeling a little sore, not altogether, though partly, because he had been wounded in his self-esteem. But this did not last. The matter was too trivial to annoy him for long. He forgot all about it in his work. It was just 2 weeks later, at about 4 in the afternoon, when the door of Stacy's office was thrown open and Ames Price strode in. Stacy's first feeling was one of surprise and repressed amusement, for he had not seen Ames since the evening of the outrageous jest played on him at the roadhouse. Stacy's second emotion, following immediately, was a sick, comprehending horror. It was as though he had known everything beforehand in a dream that he had forgotten, and that had fought in vain to break loose and summon him. Ames's heavy face was set, in a struggle for self-control, and his voice when he spoke was thick and difficult. "Come with me, Carol," he stammered. Stacy had already sprung to his feet. He was paler than Ames. "Yes," he said, and snatched up his hat. The other clenched his fists. "You mean to say you know already? Damn you! Someone's told you?" "No," said Stacy dully. "No. Come on." Slowly, through the office. No fuss. Got to smile. Latimer said so. It was as though Ames were reciting a ritual. Together they went down in the elevator and out of the building. It was August, but the car that Ames had brought was a closed car. Latimer again, thought Stacy, with a touch of loathing beneath the horror that filled his mind. They set off swiftly. "It's Marian," said Ames. "She shot herself this morning. Dying. She asks for you." He looked at Stacy, dully rather than with hatred. It was this, of course, or something like it, Stacy knew already. But to hear it in words was abominable. A chill ran over his body. He felt physically nauseated. He set his teeth. "In much pain?" he muttered. "No." The car drove up beneath the porte-cochere of the Price's house, and the two men got out. They went upstairs together silently. In Marian's exquisite boudoir stood a black group of people. Stacy recognized none of them at first, only caught a feeling of their heavy incongruity in that place. Then he saw that Mr. Latimer was one, and that another was a doctor whom he knew. There was a nurse also. From somewhere Mrs. Latimer appeared, and Stacy perceived that she was a haggard old woman. A look of relief softened her eyes a very little at sight of him. "She wants to see you, Stacy," Mrs. Latimer murmured. "I'll speak to the doctor outside," and she went through a door. Presently she returned with the doctor. "You can go in," he said. Stacy pulled him aside a little way. "It won't do any harm?" he demanded hoarsely. "No, no harm. Better to let her have her way. There's nothing to be done. The bullet missed her heart and penetrated the lung instead. The wound is dressed. Be as calm as you can." "There's no hope?" "Not the faintest. She is— well, there's no hope," replied the doctor rather kindly. "Just a minute, then," said Stacy. He leaned against a wall and struggled for composure. Then he wiped his forehead with his handkerchief. "All right," he said, and went through the door with the doctor and Marion's mother. The room beyond was hushed, cool and darkened. Mrs. Latimer led Stacy to the bedside, then withdrew to a distant corner of the room and stood there, motionless, with the nurse and the doctor. When he looked that way, he could see them like dim figures in the background of some faded Venetian picture. "Is that Stacy?" asked a thin voice. "Yes," he murmured, and knelt by the bed. Marion was propped up within it, and her face, that was turned sideways toward him on the pillows, was like alabaster, thin, veined and bloodless, but her beauty was unmarred, heightened even, like a statue of her beauty. The only color anywhere was in her bright hair that was spread about the pillow. "I'm glad you've come," she said. "Take my hand." He did so gently. Her voice was scarcely more than a musical murmur, and between phrases she gasped for breath. "Don't talk," he begged. "Let me talk to you, Marion." "No," she said. "I must talk to you, Stacy. Not much, only a little." She paused, panting. Stacy was wrenched with pain. This was unbearable. His forehead was damp with sweat. "I wanted to tell you," she went on, almost inaudibly. "Oh, lots of things. Not to worry, for one. It's just as well. Only, isn't it like me," she said with a faint smile, "to fail, even in this?" "Marion, please," he muttered, tightening his hold on her hand for an instant. It was the pathos of her frail attempt at cynicism that shook him. For now she no longer looked the weary, perfect, grown-up woman. She seemed a little girl. To watch her die was like watching a child die, or a dream. "I hurt you, Stacy. I didn't mean to," she said softly, and managed to stroke his hand, ever so faintly. It was, perhaps, the first time he had found tenderness in her. He set his teeth hard. "I must say what I have to, quickly," she went on. "You are not to blame yourself, Stacy. You have nothing to do with it." She paused for a moment, struggling for breath. "I was all wrong, twisted. You were right. You couldn't love me, or I you. Not even you. I could not bear life any longer, having made such a mess of it." She closed her eyes weakly, and he thought that she slept or had died. But presently they fluttered open again. "I'm sorry," she murmured, "that I said what I did to you the other day. It was not true, and I did not mean it, even then." "Oh," he cried in a choked voice, "don't, Marion." She held his fingers close. "Poor Stacy," she whispered. "It's not your fault." Again she paused, and after a moment an elfish smile stirred her lips. "Do I look a fright?" she asked. "No. Lovely." "Well, that's good," she murmured, with the ghost of a laugh. Parthenon. They were both silent for a while. "Now I'm sleepy. You may go. But first kiss me, Stacy, dear." He bent over and touched her white cheek with his lips, then rose slowly to his feet and made his way back unsteadily to the others. "I don't know," he muttered hoarsely to the doctor. "You'd better feel her pulse." The doctor went quickly to the bed, then after a moment returned. "Just the same, only a little weaker. She's asleep," he whispered. Stacy looked at Mrs. Latimer. "I'll go then. You'll keep me informed? By phone?" he pleaded. She nodded, taking his hand for an instant. He returned to the other room dizzily. "She's sleeping just now," he said to Marion's husband. "Will you have your car take me home?" They went out into the hall together. Stacy stumbled, and Ames grasped his arm and held it. But Mr. Latimer had followed them. "Stacy," he said, "just a moment." Stacy turned mechanically to stare at him. He had only been vaguely aware of the man's presence. "It is perhaps unnecessary for me to warn you to say nothing of this," said Marion's father stonily. "It must be kept out of the papers." It was just what Stacy needed. He straightened up, anger rushing through him like a hot flood. "Go to hell," he said, then swung about and walked quickly and firmly downstairs, with Ames following. At the door of the car, the two men gazed at each other helplessly. There was no antagonism between them now. In some odd way, they were even united. "I'm glad you said that to Latimer," Ames remarked dully. So was Stacy glad. His anger was all that sustained him on the ride home. For he felt that everything was Mr. Latimer's fault. All the worst of Marion he had given her. Almost he had pointed the revolver. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Lonely Warrior by Claude C. Washburn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Stacy let himself in with a latchkey, then hurried up the stairs to his own rooms. Once in his study, he threw himself down upon a couch, and lay there for a long time motionless, his hands thrown back and clasped beneath his head. But there was no relaxation in his stillness. His body was tense, and now and then a spasm contracted the taut muscles of his face. The late western sunlight poured in through the windows and flickered brightly across the wall, and the shrill, distant voices of children at play were audible. At last Stacy turned his head slowly to look at a small traveling clock on a stand near the couch. The hands pointed to 6:30. He got up with an effort, pressed the button of a bell, then sat down at his desk, rested his head on his hands, and stared blindly out of the window. "If Mrs. Blair is in," he said, without moving, when Parker entered the room, "please ask her if she will be so kind as to come up here for a few minutes." "Yes, sir," said the man, and went out. Presently Catherine tapped at the door, and Stacy rose wearily. "Come in," he called. She looked fresh and very young to him who felt so old. "You wanted to see me?" she began, then broke off to gaze at him in alarm. "Stacy," she cried, "what's the matter?" "Catherine," he said in a monotonous voice, "do me a favor, please. Tell my father I won't be down to dinner, and why. Marion Latimer shot herself this morning. She is dying. I have just been there. It has rather knocked me out." Catherine had turned pale, and her eyes were wide with horror. "Oh," she gasped, then suddenly went closer to him. "Stacy," she said gently, "sit down." He obeyed and resumed his former pose, staring again out of the window. "Don't let the servants hear what you say," he went on in the same dead tone. "It's to be kept secret. And don't let father come up to see me. He would be kind, but I can't see him now." She drew in her breath sharply, but said nothing, only laid her hand on his shoulder. At this he swung about, as though the touch had loosened something within him. It's the ghastly waste that gets me. So hard," he cried, his face set with pain. "Death itself, that's nothing. An episode. But to see so much loveliness, so much fineness, all go wrong, obliquely, to futile death, as to a climax. It's unbearable." "Stacy, Stacy," Katharine whispered. "And it's all my fault." "No, no, you mustn't." "But yes, my fault. If I could only have gone on loving her, or if, not loving her, I had married her, things might have been different. Not so complete a mess. We'd have become adjusted, somehow." Katharine drew up a chair swiftly and sat down close to him. "Stacy," she cried unsteadily, her eyes shining with tears, "I beg of you, you mustn't. The truth is bad enough. Ah, please don't go beyond the truth. It was not your fault, only inasmuch as what happens to anyone in the whole world is one's fault. Poor lovely Marian. There was something, I don't know, something twisted in her." At this and at the soft compassion of her voice, Stacy looked toward Katharine differently. "Twisted. It was what she called herself only half an hour ago," he said in a gentler tone. They were silent for a time. Something in the young woman's clear presence comforted him. "She looked like a little girl, Katharine," he said at last, only sorrowfully. "You would not have known her. And so beautiful. Oh, wicked!" Again his face contracted. And, indeed, though he did not see it at the moment, as poignant an emotion for him as any in all the tragedy lay in the destruction of so much sheer beauty. Afterward, weeks afterward, he perceived this, and recognized with pain that Marian herself had understood it, even tenderly, at the last. The bell of the telephone on Stacy's desk rang, and he reached slowly for the receiver. Katharine gazed at him apprehensively, but he spoke quietly enough, just a few words, in reply to the message, then hung up the receiver and turned to Katharine. "She is dead," he murmured. "She died in her sleep. She never waked after I left her." There was nothing to say. The two sat there in silence for some minutes. "You must go down, Katharine," Stacy said finally. "It is almost 7. Thank you." She rose reluctantly. "You'll let me have something sent up to you?" "No, no, I can't eat," he exclaimed with revulsion. "I have to think," he added, "of what to say to Mrs. Latimer. I must go to see her after a while. What can I say?" Katharine gave him a look in which there was something like pride. But all that she answered was that he must eat something, then went out. He sat there, reflecting painfully. He felt tired, hopeless, alive in a dead, empty world, but he was less tense now. After a while, in half an hour perhaps, the door opened and Katharine herself came in with a tray. He smiled faintly at this. "You will have your way, won't you?" he remarked, but he ate a little while she sat watching him. "Stacy," she asked diffidently when he had finished, "should you like me to go with you?" "To Mrs. Latimer's?" he exclaimed. "Oh, would you? But no," he added impatiently. "Why should I lay things on you?" "You won't be doing that. If I could, perhaps, share a little, I should be glad. You've had nearly enough, I think." "You're kind," he said gruffly. "All right, come. Now?" He nodded. "Then I'll go for a wrap and come back at once." "Oh," he said with a start, when she returned, "I must order the car brought around." And he reached for the telephone. "It's at the door," she replied simply. And when they went down the stairs, they met nobody either there or in the hall. That too was Katharine's work, he thought, with a softening touch of gratitude. He sat silent during the ride, trying to think what he should say to Mrs. Latimer. But he could find nothing. He could only trust to the moment. It was a horrible task, yet he was not undertaking it as a duty. He was going only because he was overwhelmingly sorry for his old friend and concerned about her. At any rate, Catherine's quiet presence was of some help. He felt her as not weak in her compassion, but strong. It demanded a real effort for him to ring the bell of the Latimers' house, but he did so, and after a little while a maid opened the door. "Has Mrs. Latimer got back yet?" Stacy asked in a low tone. "Yes, sir, but she said—" "I know. She could not see anyone. But she will want to see me, I think. Just let me go quietly in. She is in the drawing room?" "Yes, sir, with Mr. Latimer." Stacy winced. This made it harder. But he went quietly through the hall and into the familiar room, and Catherine followed him a step or two behind. Just across the threshold he paused. Only a single shaded reading lamp was burning, and that at the farthest corner of the long room, so that the part nearest Stacy was all in darkness. At first the only person in the room appeared to be Mr. Latimer, who, his hands clasped behind his back, was pacing up and down across the far end of it, from lamp to window and from window to lamp. When he approached the lamp and turned, his face was illuminated from below, so that the chin and the delicate selfish mouth showed clearly, while the eyes and forehead remained shadowy. Stacy could not conquer his feeling of bitter hardness. The man was suffering, no doubt, in his own way, but he was not generous enough, so Stacy thought, to suffer deeply. He looked proud even now, when it was no time for pride. He should have been comforting his wife. And what had he done? What had he done? Could he not understand? But Stacy gave him only a moment of thought. His eyes were searching the room for Mrs. Latimer. And presently he found her, a wrecked, huddled figure on a couch, just opposite him. Her face was hidden among the cushions. Only her hair, her dark dress, and one clenched hand were visible. Stacy took a step forward. "Mrs. Latimer," he said. She sat up with a gasp, but it was her husband who spoke. "Who is there?" he called sharply, pausing and gazing toward Stacy. "It is Stacy Carroll, sir." Mr. Latimer stiffened. "This is no time for you to come to this house," he said coldly. "You should know that. I do not wish to see you." "No," Stacy replied, "but I came to see Mrs. Latimer, unless she would prefer not to have me." The woman on the couch leaned forward. "Oh, yes, Stacy," she cried in a tone that went to his heart. He was sure of himself now. He was indifferent to what Mr. Latimer might say. The older man stood there, erect in the lamplight, handsome, implacable, but to Stacy non-existent. "Either you or I, Carroll, must leave this house," he said haughtily. "Both of us—" But at this Mrs. Latimer had sprung to her feet, tottering a little. "Then," she cried, in a tense voice that told Stacy much, "it must be you, Herbert. I wish to see Stacy. Oh," she murmured weakly, but with relief. "And Catherine, you've come. How good." And she sank down again upon the couch. As Stacy moved toward her, he too, for a moment, thought of Catherine. He knew well how shy, how retiring, even how shrinking she was by nature. Yet all through this brief unpleasant scene he had felt her standing there, gently strong, not wincing. But Mr. Latimer said only, "As you please," and left the room. Stacy knelt on the rug before the couch. But though Mrs. Latimer touched his hair tremblingly, and had sent away her husband to have him there, it was to Catherine that she turned, clasping her hand and making the young woman sit down close beside her on the divan. The half hour that followed was atrocious, worse than anything Stacy had ever been through. For he had seen bodies shockingly tortured and minds driven to madness by pain and terror. But this was the destruction of a noble personality, of a character built up bravely through long effort. It was the negation of everything. And the worst of it was that in the broken phrases that Mrs. Latimer cried out, sometimes to him, mostly to Catherine, traces remained of her high, clear, unified intelligence, like drifting debris of a wrecked ship. "My little girl, my poor baby," she broke out once. "A child again, only when dying. Wasted, wasted, all for nothing, a whole life. Oh, it's my fault. No, his, this with a terrible fierceness. No, mine too, mine too." But there were pauses of exhaustion between her outbursts, and after a while she grew slightly calmer, merely clinging to Catherine, who spoke little, but in a tone of infinite tenderness. Beneath everything else, Stacy felt an awe of Catherine for her deep calm that expressed the very opposite of indifference. As for himself, he could find nothing to do, which was perhaps as well, save once to slip out into the hall and telephone the doctor whom he had seen at Marion's bedside to say that he must come with something to put Mrs. Latimer to sleep. "If I make you some chocolate, dear, will you drink it, will you not?" asked Catherine at last, pleadingly. "If you wish," Mrs. Latimer answered, worn out and quieted. But she kept the young woman's hand tightly clasped in hers, so that Catherine looked up at Stacy for a moment with a faint questioning smile. For the first time tears started to his eyes. There was so much of selfless weary beauty in the look she gave him. He nodded, went quickly out to the kitchen, found the scared cook, and presently himself brought in the chocolate, which Mrs. Latimer drank with trembling gulps, Catherine holding the cup. Then the doctor came, and with Catherine's help put Mrs. Latimer to bed, while Stacy waited below. At last Catherine came down again, and they went out to the car. Her face looked tired and drawn. The strain had been horrible. Stacy himself, who had perforce borne so small a share of it, was ready to drop. "Thank you," he said almost timidly after a moment. "I'm sorry not to have been able to do more. It wasn't fair to you. You did so much." "I?" she exclaimed, but she was resting her head against the upholstered back of the seat. "Poor lady," she murmured then, "so pitifully broken. It wasn't only herself that Marion hurt." "I don't suppose it ever is," said Stacy wearily. Catherine gave him a look of sympathy. "Can you sleep, do you think?" she asked. But at this he sat erect. "I refuse to have you bother your head about me too," he said sharply. "Yes, I know I can sleep." Mr. Latimer and the others interested succeeded in keeping the truth hidden. Officially, even according to the account given by the sensational evening paper, the death was an accident. There had been burglaries. The times were unsafe. There was a wave of crime in Vernon. Marion had been placing a revolver in the drawer of her desk, and all the rest of it. Privately, no one believed the story, and the various things that people did believe were too wild to deserve mention. But officially, everyone believed it. Officially, everyone in Vernon always believed what he should. This was Vernon's great strength. Stacy did not recover easily from the shock. Perhaps it even worked some permanent change in him, for it left him bruised, saddened, yet somehow calmer and cooler. He worked tremendously at the office, and in the days immediately following the tragedy did indeed value his work mostly as a means to temporary forgetfulness. He saw but few people, and only 2 or 3 of these willingly, for he found it hard to talk. He was glad enough to see Edwards now and then at the luncheon hour, at least after their first meeting, when, to excuse the manner he simply could not help, Stacy felt obliged to tell him, who came from an outside world, that Marion Price had been an old friend, and that he was pretty cut up by her death, which was hard. Yet Edward's gruff, awkward expression of sympathy was not unpleasant. Stacy's memory of Marian was as of something delicate, lovely and frustrated, and it was softened by that final unwanted touch of tenderness she had shown. But he could never quite forgive Marian what she had done to her mother. In this she had been her father's daughter, callous toward others, the Latimers, hard at bottom. He went as often as he could to see Mrs. Latimer, or took her out with him into the park. She recovered from the terrible prostration of that first night, even quickly. She regained an adequate composure of manner, and her sensitive receptive mind was intact. She had always had the faculty of true intuition, which is, as opposed to the false intuition that means merely guessing, the faculty of thinking so swiftly that the logical steps along the way are barely brushed by the flying thought, and the conclusion is so quickly reached that to the breathless beholder it appears to have been attained at one leap. This faculty she did not lose, but in her own attitude toward the world she was sadly changed, no longer a strong, flexible personality armed with a gentle irony, giving more than she took, unafraid of facts. She had become a weak, shaken woman with no shelter for her sensitive soul. Almost terrified she seemed at times. And it was Stacy who now tried to give her the support she had formerly tried to give him. He noted one peculiarity that seemed rather horrible to him. For at least 2 months after Marian's death, Mrs. Latimer could not see her husband enter a room where she was without giving a shudder of revulsion at his presence. One thing of good Stacy had gained from the tragedy. He knew Catherine now. Not entirely, by any means, but it was as though he had found a key to the locked door of her personality and had opened the door and stepped inside just a little way. The intense shyness that wrapped her about had nothing to do with self-consciousness. He had always known that. Now he began to understand that the noble quality of herself lay in her very selflessness. She barely thought of herself consciously at all, and thus to have others do so disturbed her. She gave and took nothing. It was through her immense capacity for pity, not a pity whimpering weakly over a wretched world, but a strong, useful pity, that one got to know her. She had given so much of her selflessness to Stacy at the time of the catastrophe that she had given of herself too. She could not now take back what she had given, even if she wished to do so. He was shocked and numbed by what had happened, and she continued instinctively to give him all the quiet, lavish help she could. She was giving perhaps more than she knew. One day she even brought him one of the articles she had written for a London weekly. She was humble about it, but at heart he was even humbler. For, simply worded, with no pretense at decoration, a brief, clearly stated apology for the "let us eat, drink and be merry" attitude of the day, it radiated a gentle warmth of feeling. Afterward she showed Stacy other articles. Generally he trod very carefully, taking pains to say nothing that might drive this half-held prodigal friend back from being shadowy barriers of reserve. But one Sunday afternoon in October, when they had gone for a walk in the country, and the boys up ahead were plunging deliriously through heaps of dead leaves, he suddenly turned on her. "Catherine," he said, "you give so much, always, but you cannot be all selflessness. There must be a hidden self in you that could take a little." She gave him a startled look and did not speak. It was as though she had retreated to a great distance. Still she was there. He had thought she might vanish utterly. "I think it's a kind of shy, maiden self that you neglect," he added. "You know next to nothing about it." "Oh," she murmured, "I do take." But he was astonished and remorseful to perceive that her lips were trembling and her eyes moist. "Did I shock you, Catherine?" he exclaimed. "Silly meddler I am! I've no business to bother you." "No, no," she returned. "It's not that. It's only that you're so kind." "I?" he cried in amazement. "Yes," she said, and then suddenly smiled at his expression. Well, he remarked helplessly, if prying into your thoughts can be called kindness, and paused. The kindness is in what you do it for, she said quietly, and they came up with the boys. It was far closer than he had ever approached her before. Stacy's intimacy with his father, too, was closer since the tragedy. Mr. Carroll could hardly be expected to understand the strange relationship that had held Marion and Stacy together and apart. He did not even have the necessary facts to go on. But he saw with all his direct clearness the effect of Marion's sudden death on his son, and was very kind and tactful as well. He even took obvious pains to avoid discussion of subjects, such as Bolshevism, labor and the Republican Party, on which he perhaps fancied his son did not at heart agree with him. This touched Stacy, but was quite unnecessary. Stacy had no more interest in Bolshevism or the other things than in Mabinogion. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Lonely Warrior by Claude WASHBURN. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In November, a strike of the street railway employees broke out. The company, which had applied for and obtained a 7-cent fare 6 months earlier, had now asked for the right to raise it to 10 cents. The city council refused, whereupon the company, alleging its inability to carry on at even a modest profit under the existing costs, declared a 20% cut in wages, and the employees struck. The clash was fierce, and there was much violence. The company imported strikebreakers from Chicago. They were mobbed, there were deaths, the militia was called out, and a few empty cars with shattered windows ran occasionally up and down the city streets. Stacy was not particularly interested, having other things to think about. He barely glanced at the news headlines and smiled ironically as he did so, knowing that Colin Jeffries, who had a controlling interest in the stock of the street railway company, also virtually owned the evening Republican paper, and was engaged in many business enterprises with the owner of the morning Democratic paper. As for the editorials, he would no more have read them than he would have read the latest novel by Harold Bell Wright. But sometimes his father read them aloud at table in a tone of fierce assent, and thus Stacy learned that they were all about 100% Americanism, and the duty of labor to yield something, just as capital was yielding something. However, one afternoon Edwards, whom Stacy had not seen for a week, suddenly entered the office. "Hello," cried Stacy cordially. "Come in. Where have you been?" Then broke off at sight of the other's appearance. Edwards was unshaven and rather dirty, and his eyes glowed darkly in his tense face. He shut the door behind him, then sat down opposite Stacy at the desk. "I want to talk to you, Carroll," he said. "It's about the strike." "All right," said Stacy. "I hardly know anything about it. Haven't followed it." Edwards' eyes suddenly blazed. "No," he cried. "Of course not. What's it all matter to you? You're all right. You're not your brother's keeper. Now look here," said Stacy, firmly but pleasantly enough. "Cut out the class business, will you? You know that's not the way you feel about me, or you wouldn't be coming here to see me. I haven't a doubt but that the men are right in this strike. But the reason I've kept off the subject as much as possible is because I don't see what in the world I can do about it, and I don't know anything worse than futile sentimental sympathy." "I apologize, Carroll," Edwards returned moodily. "I didn't mean that, of course. And I'd probably better apologize in advance for anything else I may break loose and say. I haven't had much sleep lately." "That's all right," Stacy replied. "Go as far as you like." "Carroll," said Edwards painfully, "we're beaten. I mean, on every big thing. There isn't going to be any change in the rotten system, not for now. There isn't going to be any revolution. There isn't going to be a beginning of socialism, all men sharing tasks, each according to his capacity. There's just going to be the same tyranny there's always been, the same exploitation of a lot of men by a few. I tell you, I'm broken-hearted." He paused, his face set. "You must be," said Stacy, "if you hoped for that." "Oh, I did and I didn't. I thought maybe, but now this strike," he went on sharply. "6 months ago there'd have been a general strike in sympathy. Every workman in the city would have downed tools. Not now. We're beaten, I tell you. There are thousands of unemployed. Winter's here. Coal costs what you know. The men don't dare. Beaten. You've heard what one of the big employers said openly, that pretty soon the men would be eating out of their hands. And here am I fighting for this puny little thing, that men be doled out enough to exist on. And fighting in vain." Stacy looked at him with silent sympathy. "Here," said Edwards, tearing papers from his pocket. "Here are the figures. Here's what it costs a family of 3 to live. Government statistics. Here's what the men were getting. Here's what they're to get now if they yield." He pushed the papers across the table. Stacy fingered them, but kept his eyes on his friend. "I know," he said. "I can imagine without studying them. What do you want me to do?" "I don't know," said Edwards nervously. "I'd thought of 2 or 3 things. If you were to print the facts, just the facts, with your name signed to them in one of the papers—" Stacy smiled bitterly. "Fat chance. How much of a power in this town do you think I am? Don't you know that Colin Jeffries, who owns the street railway, controls the papers?" "Yes, I know that, damn him," Edwards burst out. "He's everywhere. You can't get out from under his shadow. And even if I could get such an article printed, what would it accomplish? When did the public ever budge? Inert mass of sheep. And all the time the paper's harping on the idea that the street railway company can't pay its stockholders even a nominal interest on their investment under current conditions." "Well," Edwards fairly shouted, "and if they can't? Do you know anything about that company? I do. I've looked into it with a lawyer. Way overcapitalized. 3 millions of water, Carol. 3 cool millions into private pockets. So men must starve, must they, to pay interest on that stock?" Stacy's face was grim. "No," he said shortly. "I hadn't looked into it, but it doesn't surprise me. I'll tell you what I could do," he said, hesitatingly after a moment. The only available income I have is what I make here at the office. I could turn over, say, $250 a month of it to the union. And I might, that is, I don't know what my sister does with her income. Gives most of it away, I fancy. But I dare say she'd put in as much more." Edwards stared. "Say," he said shakily, "that's decent. I thought you had— Well, it's none of my business. But it wouldn't be any use, Carol. Not 1/100th part enough. But thanks." "Oh," said Stacy deprecatingly, then fell to thinking. "Look here," he remarked finally, "there's only one thing I can think of, and it will have to be you to do rather than I. Also, it's only a faint chance. Now my father is an honest man, set in his beliefs, but honest. And he's also influential. Colin Jeffries probably defers as much to him as to anyone living, because father's very likely the only thoroughly honest, disinterested friend Jeffries has. Father believes in the principles Jeffries only exploits to make money out of. If you can get him, my father I mean, on your side, he might take the matter up to Jeffries personally." Edwards' face expressed extreme dislike of the suggestion. "Can't say I care much for the idea. Like begging for what you've a right to." "I didn't suppose you would. But I estimate that what you're out for is to save a living wage for these men, by any means." "Yes," Edwards muttered, "I'd do anything. But how on earth could I swing your father into line?" "Well," said Stacy slowly, "come over to the house this evening at 8:15, just when dinner's over, and talk to him. Always about the personal side, the facts of it. Show him the figures, and keep away from all discussion of principles. Appeal to his sense of fair play to get him to go down with you tomorrow morning and see the men themselves." Edwards reflected. "All right," he said sullenly, and rose. "Mind now," Stacy called after him. "No principles." Stacy made himself very agreeable at dinner that evening. He was keyed up by anticipation. His eyes glowed, and he looked younger. There was an added warmth in the harmony that had been lately achieved in the Carroll house. But Stacy saw Katharine glance at him wonderingly. It wasn't possible to hide feelings from Katharine. He caught her alone for a moment on the way to the library. "Now listen," he said. "You stick by me. Don't budge from the library, and support me in every way you can." Her dark eyes were curious, but her lips curved faintly into a smile, perhaps at his tone of command, that was so unlike his customary tone with her. He would explain nothing, however, only marched her on down the hall, and a very few minutes later Parker came in to say that a Mr. Edwards had called. "Oh, yes," Stacy exclaimed. "He's a friend of mine. Bring him in, Parker. Or, no, I'll go get him myself." And he went out. "Take it easy now, and no principles," he growled to Edwards as he piloted him in. "Father," Stacy remarked, "this is my friend, Edwards. Was commander of the Legion post, you know. Mrs. Blair, Mr. Edwards." "How do you do, sir?" said Mr. Carroll, shaking hands. His face had assumed its keen, yet non-committal, business look. Mr. Carroll knew something about Edwards, of course, and disapproved of what he knew. But he was a courteous gentleman in his own house. Such a man as Mr. Latimer, artistically conscious of every attitude, could not have expressed the situation more nicely. "I wanted to say a few words to you, sir, about this strike," Edwards began, sitting down awkwardly in the chair toward which Stacy had impelled him. Mr. Carroll did not apply at once. He gnawed at his mustache. His eyes grew harder, and he shot one swift, angry glance at Stacy. Up to now, Stacy had been rather pleased with himself. He thought he had engineered things well. It suddenly struck him that, instead, he had made a mess of them. His father was angry with him, and therefore more hostile to Edwards. And Edwards was nowhere near at his best. He was gauche, heavy, impressed by his surroundings. It had never occurred to Stacy that he might be, and correspondingly resentful. Oh, Lord! Stacy looked across helplessly at Katharine. She had poured out another cup of coffee, and now handed it to the guest. "Will you have sugar, Mr. Edwards?" she asked. "No, no, thank you," he replied, startled, and took the cup gingerly. He looked as though he would much rather have refused it had he dared. Mr. Carroll turned his eyes back to the young man. "I have no connection with the street railway company, Mr. Edwards," he said deliberately, choosing his words with care. "On the basis of such information as I have been able to obtain in regard to the strike, my sympathies are with the company. I fail to see why capital should have to make all the sacrifices and labor none. But since you, and Stacy, wish it, I shall be glad to hear you state the men's side of the case. I should think, however, that some official of the street railway company would be the proper person to hear it." Edwards, who had flushed, made a quick angry gesture. But this almost upset the fragile cup that he held. So he was forced into restraint. He drank his coffee hastily before replying. "Well, sir," he began then, Stacy, thought if I could give you the facts as I did to him, you'd maybe see them our way. I don't want to talk about principles, sir." "Why not?" Edwards glanced wrathfully at Stacy. "Because we wouldn't agree about them, and there wouldn't be any use in our trying to." His hand trembled slightly, and the tiny silver spoon rattled against his coffee cup. So he rose and limped over to a table to rid himself of the nuisance once for all. Katharine leaned forward. "Stacy told me you had been wounded in the war, Mr. Edwards," she said softly. He looked toward her. "Yes, ma'am," he returned, "at Les Eparges. My right leg was rather shot to bits." Stacy drew a breath of relief. He hardly thought Catherine was being deliberately tactful. She had spoken impulsively. But the result was excellent, and Edwards, in the tone with which he replied to Catherine, revealed that old-fashioned attitude of deference toward women just as women, which was also Mr. Carroll's attitude. "I hope they fixed you up all right," said Mr. Carroll gruffly. "Pretty well, thanks. I happened to draw a good surgeon." As for Stacy, he said nothing at all. He had that much sense anyway, he told himself. He'd have to face his father later on. For the present, he wanted to be as nearly forgotten as possible. So he sat still and commented silently on the shifting fortunes of the battle. "Have a cigar, Edwards?" asked Mr. Carroll, holding out his case. Good. There was a touch of something more personal in this. "No, thank you, sir." Oh, confound it, why didn't he take one? Edwards drew his papers from his pocket. "Mr. Carroll," he said, "I'm not going to talk to you at all about social theories, or about what sort of stock it is that the Street Railway Company wants to pay dividends on." "Well, damn it then, don't," said Stacy internally. "I only want to show you, in figures, the condition of the employees just as men. What they were getting, what they're going to get if they accept this cut in wages, what it costs a family of 3 to live today." And he began to read. He did not read aloud very well. He stuttered a little over a word now and then. But there was an intensity in his deep voice that led an odd warmth to the figures about groceries, fuel, wages, and the rest. Mr. Carroll must see that the man was in deadly earnest. When he had finished reading, he stretched out the papers. "Want to see them?" he demanded abruptly. Mr. Carroll shook his head. He was frowning and chewing at the end of his cigar. "The trouble is," he began, but with less than his usual firmness, "that you can't separate facts from principles. Labor—" "Oh," cried Catherine suddenly, "you must." 2 of the 3 men started and turned toward her. Stacy had been looking at her already. But Catherine's eyes were fixed now on the guest. "Do you mean, Mr. Edwards," she asked, in a voice that revealed both compassion and scorn, "that the highest wage of any employee would be only 40 cents an hour?" "Yes, ma'am," said Edwards bitterly, "if they accept the cut in wages." "And are there many families of 3? "Most are a good deal more than 3, he replied. "About 20% of the men are unmarried and perhaps bring the average down to 3. Catherine's face had an odd expression. Stacy thought she looked like a sorrowful goddess. "Before my husband died," she said, "we were a family of 4. We were living on $250 a month, and you thought, Mr. Carroll, that we had to live too sordidly. You will do something?" He gazed at her kindly, but did not reply at once. Stacy was touched by the mention of Phil. The thought of Phil was with him, almost like a gentle presence, very often. Catherine spoke of him seldom, but, when she did so, quite simply and naturally, as now. She must miss him sadly, Stacy thought, and felt grieved for her. But, since it was his instinct to carry through unswervingly anything he had undertaken, he was also exultant, as well as faintly amused at his father, who was being swept away from principles at every turn, simply not permitted to play with them. "I can't say I like those statistics," said Mr. Carroll at last, more to Catherine than to Edwards. Then he turned to the latter. "But I'd have to know more. I'd have to look into things. And then I don't know what I could do about it. I might do something, I suppose. Confound it, sir," he exclaimed impatiently. "Why didn't you take this up with some official of the company?" "I want you to know more, sir," Edwards returned eagerly. "I'd like it if you'd go down with me and see some of the strikers man to man and get their story." Mr. Carroll reflected, frowning. "All right," he said sharply. "Come to my office tomorrow morning at 9." Catherine's face fairly shone, and Mr. Carroll, looking back at her, relaxed his sternness and leaned over to pat her hand. "May I go too?" she asked of them both. "Yes, ma'am," said Edwards, getting up. "I'd like that." He made his adieu clumsily, with too much formality, and Stacy accompanied him down the hall to the door. "Well," Edwards remarked, "that's something, I suppose, thanks to Mrs. Blair. Precious little help you were, though, Carroll." "Oh, yes," said Stacy cheerfully. "I messed things up properly. But then, look at you. What the devil do you mean by behaving like a resentful commoner at a court function? Go on home, you sulky snob," he added with a laugh, and pushed his friend out of the door. Then he returned to the library. His father and Catherine were sitting there in silence, she gazing away with dark, abstracted eyes, he frowning slightly and staring down at a closed magazine on which he tapped nervously with his fingers. He looked up and turned to Catherine as Stacy entered. "You a member of this conspiracy, Catherine?" he asked quietly. "No," Stacy exclaimed promptly. "She wasn't. Didn't know a thing about it. It was all my damned foolishness." "I see," said Mr. Carroll and rose. "I'll go to bed, I think. Good night." But Stacy set his back against the door. "No, sir," he returned. "Let's have this out. I'll concede that I was wrong to do this in this way. Now you go ahead and tell me some more things." His father stood there, looking at him keenly, antagonistically, judging him. Mr. Carroll's upper lip was drawn in a little, and there was a harshness about his face. One could see that he had fought hard fights in life, and that he was still an adversary to be reckoned with. "I am not aware," he began coldly, "of being in my dotage yet. If anybody wants anything from me, the thing for him to do is to come and ask me for it. Then if I think he ought to have it, he'll get it. I'll be damned if I'll be cosseted and cajoled into a good humor so that something can be wormed out of me." Absolutely justified, his father was, Stacy thought helplessly. "You're perfectly right, sir," he said, "and I apologize. My only excuse for not being frank, and I admit it's not good enough, is that I was so confoundedly anxious for you to hear Edward's story, and was fool enough to think you might refuse if I asked you to, point blank." For just an instant Stacy glanced away to Catherine and saw with sharp regret that her eyes were full of pain. Why the devil had he let her in for this? Then he looked back at his father. But Mr. Carroll's wrath was not assuaged, and when he spoke again Stacy perceived that a long resentment, dangerously repressed, had burst loose finally. "You take me for a damned fool," Mr. Carroll went on angrily. "I'm a fool perhaps, but not a damned fool. Do you think I can't see how you humor me? The nice, kindly, tolerant spirit you show for my foibles. Your 'poor dad, he's growing old' attitude. Superior, sir. Intolerably superior." This was pretty bad, and all the worse for the tiny element of truth it contained. "Now look here, Dad," Stacy pleaded. "That's not so. There isn't anybody in the world I respect more than I do you. Why—" "Extraordinary method of showing it you take, then," snapped his father. "Respect nothing. At heart you're a Bolshevist, sir. Well then, if you are, be one. You're not consistent. You're a Bolshevist in theory. Oh Lord, I haven't got any theories, Stacy thought, but did not try to say. A millionaire in practice. I gave you a tidy fortune. You took it, didn't you? You live here with me in a certain amount of luxury. Well, why do you? Why don't you go and live in a hut?" He paused out of breath, glaring at his son. Stacy was pale, for this hurt. But he was further than before from losing his temper, since now the attack was unjust. To his amazement, and certainly to Mr. Carroll's as well, it was Catherine who lost her temper, or almost. "Mr. Carroll," she cried, and both men, turning suddenly toward her, saw her standing erect, a slim, firm figure with a face of angry beauty. "That's unfair and cruel and not like you. I know that Stacy cares less for money than anyone else in Vernon, and it is a shame that it should have to be I to say so. He lived for 4 years in mud and horror because he hoped it would do some good. It's wonderful that when he came back and seemed to find that it hadn't done any good, he could keep his sanity. And still he'd go and live like that again if it were of any use. And you accuse him of living here because of the luxuries you give him. He lives here because of his affection for you and because of the affection he thought you had for him. It's shameful what you said." She ceased and sat down again, her breath coming fast, her lips quivering. Stacy gazed at her, his heart beating rather quickly. He was overwhelmed with the number of his emotions. He was astounded at the brave, magnificent way she had spoken, proud that it was in his cause, deeply touched, and somehow profoundly sad. As for Mr. Carroll, he looked in a dazed way from Catherine to his son. "There is no excuse for what I said to you, son," he said at last. "I don't suppose you can forgive me. Try to, if you are able." Stacy walked over and shook his hand. "Oh, shucks, Dad," he muttered. "It's all right. Forgotten." It was the first time he had ever heard his father apologize to anyone for anything. Mr. Carroll gave his son a strange, wistful look of gratitude, then went over to Catherine. "Are you going to let me sit down beside you, Catherine?" he asked. "You're not going to pack up and leave the house just because your host's an old fool?" "No," she said in a strangled voice, giving him her hand, but keeping her face averted so that neither he nor Stacy could see it. "I am not altogether an old fool, my dear," he added, patting her hand, then got up again. A game of pinochle, Stacy?" he suggested. Stacy nodded and moved to get the card table. "Sure, I'd like one. But you don't really think you've any chance against me, do you, Dad?" he said shakily. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Lonely Warrior by Claude C. Washburn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. At breakfast next morning, no allusion was made to the promised excursion with Edwards, but Stacy was confident of its success. On this account, as well as on others, he was glad of last night's storm, for he knew his father. Mr. Carroll might fancy that principles were the foundation of his life. They were not. They were mere dead wood. First and last, it was by personal relationships that he was swayed. It was this that gave him his sweetness, his directness, his genius for holding friends, his absolute inability to be impartial. He would have made a very poor judge. As a result of the quarrel, he would be unavoidably on Edward's side, because it was Stacy's side. Mr. Carroll was nearly always gay at breakfast. On this morning he was delightful, but he did not tease Catherine as he often tried to do. Instead, he joked with the boys, with great detriment to their table manners, and reduced Jackie in particular to a condition that shocked even Carter. As for Catherine, she seemed to Stacy shyer than usual, more withdrawn. This was natural, he thought. After that splendid outburst in defense of him, she must of course retreat hurriedly into herself, which was rather obtuse of Stacy, since he should surely have known by now that for Catherine giving was not logically followed by taking back, but by further giving. At any rate, despite her silence, he felt a closeness to her, a deep intimacy with her. There was a touch of melancholy at his heart too, for he felt more than he cared to admit. He did not venture to speak much to Catherine, only a few matter-of-fact words. Ah well, last evening's scene had temporarily stripped off too many discreet veils, left emotion too naked. But by tonight everything would have become normal again. Yet Stacy did not precisely envisage this certainty with satisfaction. He motored into town with his father and Catherine, but left them at the door of the Carroll building and went on to his own office. He worked that morning with less complete absorption than usual, and at 12:30 went to the lunchroom, hoping to find Edwards. Edwards was not there, but before Stacy had finished eating, he came in, looking radiant. "It's all right, Carroll," he said gaily, limping over with a sandwich and coffee. "Your father saw things our way. There's something pretty fine about him. You can't help liking him. And then Mrs. Blair, well, she's just a wonder. The real thing." Stacy was rather calmer. "What did father say he'd do?" he asked. "Oh, he was non-committal, of course. Said he didn't know whether he could do anything, but he'd try. Remarked that Colin Jeffries was a fair man, one of the fairest he knew, also a great citizen. And I was a lamb, Carroll, swallowed that without even a gulp. So it's pretty clear he's going to take the thing up with Jeffries, or will go." Stacy considered his friend curiously. Extraordinary, this thinking in classes. Edwards did not think of capitalists as men. He thought of them as parts of a whole, which was capital. It was only capital he thought about, really, as something with an existence of its own. So he took it for granted that if you swung over one capitalist to your side, you could swing the whole, just as when you pulled back the lever of an engine, you set the entire machine in motion. Neat, very, but not true. Stacy himself, though he had suggested the scheme, was far from confident that his father could bring Colin Jeffries around, because Stacy saw the problem as a personal problem. "Well," he said soberly, "I hope father can pull it off. Come on up to the office." They sat in Stacy's room and smoked silently. "Mrs. Blair is a corker," Edwards announced suddenly. "The best ever. Do you raise many like her in your caste?" Stacy smiled. "Not so you'd notice it," he returned dryly. "Well, I'm glad of that. I should hate to find some real reason for the existence of your plutocratic bunch." "Oh, you make me tired," said Stacy wearily. "You talk like a child. At heart you have the kind of idea that the people I know are different from you. You resent it, but you have a secret feeling that they're superior. Olympians. That's because—" But at this point in his attack the telephone bell rang and he lifted the receiver. "That you, Stacy?" said his father's voice, and Stacy knew at once that the attempt had failed. "I saw Colin Jeffries about that matter. Had a long talk with him. But I couldn't budge him. Said he'd do anything else in the world for me, but that in the matter of this strike he couldn't even hear of a compromise. Said he'd be going back on every principle he had if he did. That it had come to a showdown. Was business to be run as an efficient competitive proposition with moderate financial reward, or was it to become a charitable institution, with the investors as donors? He made a strong case for his stand. Unanswerable logically. All the same— "Yes?" "Well, I've heard those statistics from Edwards, and I've seen some of the men. It's not just that they should have to live like that." "What did Jeffries say when you pointed that out?" "Said he was sorry for the men and their wives. Very. But that he had to think of the stockholders also. That they too were men and women, though you couldn't get an employee to see it." "Neat point," Stacy remarked. "Jeffries owns 2/3 of the Common himself. I've seen the list of the other stockholders. There is one widow among them. I'd be willing to defray her losses myself." "I'm sorry, son." Mr. Carroll's voice was regretful. "I'd like to have got this through for you, and because I think it's right, though of course my convictions on the labor and capital situation in general remain unchanged." "Of course." "But I did what I could." "I know it, Dad," said Stacy. "Edwards will know that too. Thanks, just as much as if you'd brought it off. Goodbye. See you at dinner." He hung up the receiver, then looked across at Edwards. "Nothing doing," he said. his face impassive. Edward's face had flushed a dull crimson, and his jaw was set, so that there was an effect of massive squareness about his head. His eyes glowed. "Yes," he replied thickly, "so I judged. Bombs, Carol. Nice little hand grenades. That's what's wanted." "I agree," said Stacy coolly. "It would be a pleasure to toss one at Jeffries, but that's no use. Never was. The reaction swings you back to below where you started." "You're so damned cold-blooded about it," Edwards cried furiously. "Can't you put yourself—" "Shut up," said Stacy harshly. "I'm twice as angry as you are, and I'm going to take a hand in this, somehow." And, in truth, an observer studying the two men carefully would have ended by believing Stacy the more dangerous. With only a little extra tautness in the muscles of his face to alter his appearance, there was yet something hard and ruthless in his expression. It was quite clear that, as Stacy had learned, nothing of his fanciful, fastidious, early self had really vanished. Neither had anything vanished of that embittered, stony, cold and passionate self he had brought back from the war. This morning, while he was at work, his thoughts about the strike and about Mr. Carroll's undertaking had been haphazard, interrupted by warm memories of the scene at home the night before. Now Stacy's whole mind was concentrated in a kind of chilly fierceness on the single problem of how he could force Colin Jeffries to yield. "It's got to be personal fighting, no principles, they're no good," he thought. "Now what handle have I got? What do I know about Jeffries?" In response to this way of putting it, a casual winter night's memory flashed into his mind. Of course! He threw up his head and laughed unpleasantly. "I've got a sort of half idea, Edwards," he observed. "Maybe it will work out. Now you run along and let me think it over. See you tomorrow." Stacy sat there, reflecting intensely, for perhaps a quarter of an hour. Then he got up, went out, and walked over to the building in which Colin Jeffries had his office. The millionaire's large outer office was full of men waiting. They sat singly or in groups and talked in low tones. Some of them, men prominent in one business or another, Stacy recognized and nodded to. He gave his card to a young man, some sort of secretary probably, who promised to take it in to Mr. Jeffries, but said he feared there wasn't the slightest chance of seeing him this afternoon except by appointment. "Take the card in anyway," Stacy remarked, and sat down. Less than 10 minutes later the secretary returned, obviously impressed, to say that Mr. Jeffries would see Mr. Carroll now, then conducted him to the financier's private office. "Come in, Stacy," said Mr. Jeffries cordially, getting up to shake hands. "Sit down, won't you?" "Thanks," said Stacy, and did so across the table from the millionaire. This being called by his first name amused him. It must be meant as a kingly compliment by Mr. Jeffries, since he and Stacy had not met above half a dozen times, or perhaps it was to aid in the effect of cordiality. But there were many other things besides amusement in Stacy's mind. He was thinking swiftly, taking stock of his adversary, all in the brief interval while he accepted and lighted a courteously proffered cigarette. This cordiality now, it was not a warmth radiating from inner goodwill. It was external, a fire built on snow. He felt the man as cold, perhaps cruel too. If so, cold even in his cruelty. Stacy felt aversion. Something in that personality was rasping to him. But he was far from feeling contempt. He recognized that he was encountering a strong and steely character, not one, like most, only apparently strong. Not a touch here of the business man, as shown in romances or movies, no nervous movement of papers, no abstracted air of meditation on vast enterprises. Mr. Jeffries did not even say that he could spare Stacy a few minutes of his time, He was as leisurely as though he were lounging at a club. Yet the man was intensely busy from morning to night, and at this moment his outer office was crowded with those waiting to see him. "It was about the street railway strikers that I wanted to speak to you, Mr. Jeffries," said Stacy, blowing out his match. There had only been that much of a pause. A look of regret came over the millionaire's face. "I'm sorry, Stacy," he replied, shaking his head slowly, "but there's nothing I can do. I explained my position to your father this morning." "Yes, I know you did," Stacy continued carefully, "but you and he are so much alike." They were alike superficially. Stacy disclaimed almost passionately that there was any deep likeness. "That I feel sure you must both see this trouble as a matter of principle, as labor versus capital, as a strike, not as men striking. The men can't live on the wages you're offering to pay them, Mr. Jeffries. Can't live." "And the company can't live and give them any better ones," returned Mr. Jeffries quietly. Stacy did not express his opinion of the company's right to life. He attended quietly to what Mr. Jeffries said. All this was no use anyway. "There's more in this than you see, Stacy. It's a test case, an unfortunate one, I grant you. Test cases are rarely the ones a man would choose. It's come to a question of whether business organized on private capital can exist at all. If it can't, we'd better know it at once. If it can, then it will have to be run on the basis of a decent adjustment between receipts and disbursements." Stacy, quite unmoved by this, shook his head. "I don't see how this can be a test case," he observed. "Suppose you win. It's a paper victory only. Neither these men nor any others can work for you permanently at a wage that won't support them and their families. Know what I think?" he demanded, gazing sharply at the older man. "I rather think the whole thing's a threat held over the head of the city council." Mr. Jeffries laughed. "That's shrewd of you, Stacy," he remarked. "But if so, you'll admit it's not very successful." Stacy, wary because of the note of flattery, continued to gaze at him. How keen the man was! Not once had he said, "You young men who've come back with socialist ideas." He had met Stacy with apparent candor, and with no touch of tolerant superiority. His manner proclaimed equality, but perhaps just faintly over-proclaimed it. "You won't even consider yielding?" Stacy asked, "so that these men can support their families, now, in winter?" "I can't, my boy. It's to your credit, though, that you take the thing so much to heart. I admire you for it." The "my boy" and the admiration were under the circumstances a little too much for Stacy. The muscles of his face hardened almost imperceptibly, and he leaned back in his chair. "Then, Mr. Jeffries, I've got to fight you," he said coolly. The other's expression did not alter. No glint of amusement shone in his eyes. But he considered Stacy intently. "I'm sorry for that," he returned after a moment, "but I guess I can only say, go to it. I know it will be a fair fight anyway." "No," said Stacy, "it won't be. I want to warn you." The other's gaze sharpened. "Well?" he asked quietly. "Mr. Jeffries," Stacy inquired, "do you remember a young woman named Ethel Wyatt?" "Yes," replied the financier, his expression unchanged. "She was governess to our children for a time. There were reasons which made us let her go. Why?" That last sentence was the only hint of weakness. Stacy felt an evil exultation. However, his face was impassive. "I was told in confidence," he observed quietly, "that she left of her own accord because you hid in her bathroom and otherwise persecuted her." A faint color shone on Mr. Jeffries' high cheekbones, and his eyes hardened until they became like polished steel, but when he spoke his tone was quiet and firm as before. Stacy reluctantly admired him. "That's not a pretty story," he said. "I shan't even trouble to deny it. May I ask why you repeat it to me?" "Because I intend to use it against you." Mr. Jeffries considered him fixedly. "That seemed to be what you were driving at. I could hardly believe that I understood your meaning correctly. We'll waive all the moral aspects of such blackmail." "Yes, let's," said Stacy calmly. Mr. Jeffries frowned at the insolence of the interruption. Only from a certain tautness in his face could Stacy perceive that he was very angry, so well did he keep himself under control. "Do you really fancy," he demanded, his words like sharp staccato taps of a hammer, "that anyone of any account, in this city is going to believe such a story?" "Not officially, of course," Stacy replied. "Being the power you are, Mr. Jeffries, you could go out in the street and commit publicly almost any crime short of murder, and officially even the witnesses wouldn't admit that you'd done it. But privately, most people will love to believe such a story." "Do you believe it?" "Oh, yes," said Stacy indifferently, "or I wouldn't use it. But, to tell you the truth, I haven't the slightest interest in the story. It doesn't even amuse me. I merely see it as a possible weapon." Mr. Jeffries continued to gaze at him sharply. "Do you know anything about this young woman, Ethel Wyatt?" he inquired presently, his voice frigid. Stacy was wary. "A little," he returned. "Then you doubtless know the sort of person she has proved to be. She has been the mistress of Ames Price, among others." "Well, you would take the word of a harlot in the matter of this libelous—" "Oh," said Stacy scornfully, "let's not go in for rhetoric. There's no dictograph in the room. Let's not be benevolent millionaire and returned hero deserving well of his country." "Very well," snapped Mr. Jeffries, his cheeks slightly flushed. "You'd take this girl's word against mine?" "Yes." Mr. Jeffries said nothing for a moment, merely regarding Stacy intently. "How you do dislike me, don't you?" he asked then. He had quite recovered his calm. Stacy raised his eyebrows. "That has nothing to do with it," he remarked coldly. "Hasn't it? You can say that and still be ready to smirch my good name and make my wife miserable?" Stacy drew himself up. "What's a man's smirched name or a weeping wife compared with a man who's undernourished and a wife who can't buy proper clothes for her children?" he demanded bitterly. "It's useless. You can't see why I'm doing this thing. For you I must have some other motive. Well, I haven't." "And you're going to use this story unless I give in on the strike? Is that the idea?" "Yes. I don't say I'm going to throw it around broadcast. Perhaps. I shall anyway tell it to my father. If you are a man, and not just a popular legend, that ought to hit you almost as hard as the other thing. Because if I were you, and had a friend like my father, I should want to keep him." For the first time, Mr. Jeffries withdrew his eyes from his enemy and looked away, frowning. "You'll hurt him a good deal," he said quietly. "When are you going to tell him?" "Tomorrow morning. I won't spoil his evening anyway." Stacy got up. "Just a minute," said the older man sharply. "I suppose you understand that you force me to play the same kind of game. I shall, of course, endeavor to learn where and how you have known this girl, since I've no doubt you got the story direct from her." "Oh, I should," said Stacy indifferently. "It might prove discreditable. Also, I should fancy that what I am doing is a criminal offense. I am really sorry for one thing, to have taken up so much of your time," he added sincerely. Mr. Jeffries considered him grimly. "You have peculiar compunctions," he observed. Stacy went back to work. He was not particularly satisfied with the interview and he felt rather soiled mentally. The threat of the story, not the story itself, was what he wanted to use. Once set going, the story would only be punishment, and he was not at all interested in punishment. But that evening during dinner, Mr. Carroll was called to the phone, and when he returned he was jubilant. "Good news, Stacy," he cried, slapping his son on the back. "Colin Jeffries has come around. Said you came up to see him and repeated the things I'd said. Told him how strongly I felt about it. Why didn't you tell me? And afterward he got to thinking things over till at last he said, 'To hell with principles. It's been my experience that if Edward Carroll wants a thing done, the thing must be right. The strike's off. It'll be in the papers tomorrow.'" Mr. Carroll settled himself again in his chair and beamed. As for Catherine, she uttered a cry of joy, then suddenly looked across at Stacy. But he avoided her eyes. However, though he felt smirched, he also felt a fierce exultation. Mr. Carroll leaned back in his chair. "Another thing Colin said, Stacy," he remarked proudly, "was that you were wasted on a job like architecture, that you had, let's see, a concentrated directness of purpose that would have got you most anywhere in business. I was to be sure to tell you that." Stacy looked up at this, startled. By Jove, the man was a good sport. Stacy was filled with admiration, and it struck him that he had been making Edward's mistake, had been seeing Colin Jeffries as a symbol, not just as an individual. Always this haze of legend hanging about everything. You had to tear it off. Later, when he had gone upstairs to bed, he fell to meditating on the whole affair. How incongruously people and things were tangled. The great street railway strike had come to an abrupt end because a year ago he, Stacy Carroll, had run off to a disreputable roadhouse with a strange, reckless girl. The entire front page of the paper next morning was occupied by Mr. Jeffries' statement. It was a masterpiece. It began by recapitulating the facts, the doubled and tripled cost of material, the city council's refusal to allow a 10-cent fare, the company's dilemma to the accompaniment of persuasive figures. The beau geste that followed was all the more effective for their convincingness. There were other things than gain in this world. There were human beings. We were our brother's keepers. Stacy thought of Edward's remark and grinned. We owed them a right to a decent existence, even at the cost of sacrifice to ourselves. A corporation was not a soulless machine. It had not, save in theory, any existence of its own. Stacy nodded approval. Good point. It was simply a group of individuals banded together, in accordance with the law, for the prosecution of a legitimate business and for the public service. The Vernon Street Railway Company was such a group, and the members of this group now, after a careful investigation of conditions, made by themselves and by disinterested friends, here complimentary mention was made of Mr. Carroll's generous initiative, felt that they could not at present, with harsh winter already here, require their employees to live on a reduced wage. This decision was taken though it meant not even a nominal profit but a considerable monthly deficit for the company. Every effort at retrenchment would be made. Economy would be rigid. The service might fall off slightly, but the public were prayed to be lenient, remembering that the company was failing in its business duty in order to accomplish a larger human duty. There were also editorials. Stacy felt no disdain, only amusement and admiration. Mr. Jeffries' telephoned message of last evening had revealed the man as not afraid to face the truth squarely. He might live in an atmosphere of magniloquent lies. That was because they served his purpose. At least, he was not himself deceived by them. Edwards was waiting for Stacy at the office. "By the Lord!" he cried, waving the paper in one hand and wringing Stacy's hand with the other. "You did it! Damned if you didn't! Now tell me, what did you do?" "Why, I just emphasized the things father had already said, and pointed out how much my father's loyalty to Jeffries meant," said Stacy innocently. Edwards stared at him. "The hell you did!" he exclaimed. "Carol, you did some sort of dirty work. Awfully dirty work, I'll bet." And he grinned with delight. "Now look here, Edwards," said Stacy soberly. "If you ever suggest that to anyone else, or if you even let on that I had anything to do in this business at all, you'll make things awfully unpleasant for me, honestly. That's all I can tell you." "Well, I won't then. You can take my word for it." "Sit down," said Stacy, dropping into a chair and lighting a cigarette. Can't possibly. I've got to get to work. Precious little I've done these last days." Nevertheless, Edwards lingered. His jubilant mood had passed now, and he looked at Stacy with a kind of awkward wistfulness. "I say, Carol," he blurted out finally, "you remember that night of the Legion meeting a year and more ago?" Stacy nodded. "Well, then I felt the better man of us two. No, I don't mean better. Saner, perhaps. You were," he puzzled, "sort of twisted." Twisted, thought Stacy. Again that word. Edwards continued after a moment, but with a shyness that in his rough, rugged personality was appealing. "Now you've got something, some solution for things. I don't know what it is exactly, but there's something. I just wanted you to know that I recognized it, that's all." "That's awfully decent of you," returned Stacy quietly. "But I don't think I've got anything really, any solution, I mean. Perhaps less than ever." Edwards shook his head. "Tell you what I think it is," he observed. "You've come to see people as on a wrong track, struggling hard for things that don't count. Food and clothes more than they need, automobiles, fine houses, all things of existence that don't get them anywhere. Totally without desire for life. That's an easy enough point of view to take intellectually, but you feel it, really live it yourself. You live in a palace, but you'd as soon live in a hut, because you don't care for those futile things. Except," he added, "when they're the bare essentials, as in this strike. Then you turn hard as flint in your will to get them, for other people. Thanks, you know. Thanks awfully. Bye." He stumbled out, waving his hand as though to ward off an answer. Stacy was touched. Edward was an idealist, for all his rude, indomitable spirit and his contact with the rough working world. Stacy knew that. Yet it was pleasant to have a friend who thought better of you than you deserved. There was one corollary to the strike. 4 days later, a grateful city council voted to allow a flat 10-cent fare. So now everyone was satisfied, except the public, who had exactly what they merited, Stacy thought. He laughed heartily, wondering a little whether Colin Jeffries had not all along counted on this possibility. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Lonely Warrior by Claude WASHBURN. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Christmas a year ago had been a ghastly festival for Stacy that he had gone through with somehow, his face stiffened into a fixed smile, his voice saying mechanical things, while within him only one emotion had been alive, the fierce, dizzy, dangerous craving to get away. From this, from everything and everyone. And it could not have been much gayer for the others. Mr. Carroll had watched his son apprehensively. Jimmy Prout, too, had fallen below his customary debonair form, and even Julie, who, though more intelligent than people gave her credit for being, was not subtle, had a grave, anxious air. Also, the thought of Phil's recent death, and of Catherine grieving in that lonely, squalid house, hung over all of them. Only Junior had been quite himself. He had in truth been the life of the party. Christmas this year was very different. Christmas Eve especially. There was not quite the old exuberance. That could never return in this grayer, sadder world, or perhaps it was merely that Julie and Stacy and Jimmy were grown up now. but there was a genial friendly warmth in the atmosphere. And then there were 3 children this year. They chattered and laughed and stamped impatiently in the long hall that led from the library to the big drawing room where the tree was being prepared, and when at last the drawing room doors were thrown open and the brilliant tree was displayed, all 3 gave a howl of joy that would have satisfied even Dickens. Mr. Carroll was extraordinarily good on such occasions. He delivered the presents, not too slowly, not too rapidly, from the great pile about the base of the tree, with a pleasant easy grace and sometimes a little speech. His own gifts he laid aside in a corner, to open later. They made an imposing heap too, for many people outside of the family delighted to remember Mr. Carroll. Women especially. He had great success with women and remained quite unspoiled by it, accepting it with apparent unconsciousness, or as a matter of course, as an aristocrat accepts his position. Old wives of old friends, young wives of friends' sons, daughters of friends, spinsters to whom he had been kind, he stirred all of them to liking. Perhaps it was Mr. Carroll's good looks, or his grace of manner, or his goodness of heart, or his youthful spirit, or all of them together. Stacy did not know, but he recognized his father's fascination, and looked with affectionate amusement at the growing pile of prettily wrapped gifts. But it did not occur to Stacy that he himself had inherited that attractiveness to women, for he had inherited the unconsciousness of it along with the trait. The 3 boys were making a tremendous racket. Julie was flushed and talkative. Jimmy Prout, a colored paper cap on his good-looking head, was lolling easily in his chair and drawing discordant wails from a toy accordion. Only Catherine seemed subdued. She sat near Julie, whom she liked warmly, and smiled and spoke quietly at times, but there was a faint tremulousness about her lips and a sensitiveness as to pain in the look of her eyes that Stacy, who caught quickly the slightest change in Catherine, perceived clearly. Perhaps it was her shyness in all this confusion. Stacy did not know. She had not seemed quite herself of late. The party broke up finally. Julie took her husband and her delirious son home, and Mr. Carroll and Stacy were left with Catherine and her 2 boys. Jackie, exhausted with happiness, sat on his mother's lap and played sleepily with a mechanical mouse. Carter leaned against Stacy's knee. Mr. Carroll sat, relaxed, in a chair near his gifts, which he showed no eagerness to open. The tree was lifeless, all its little colored candles extinguished, and the floor was strewn with ribbon and tissue paper. The room held the quiet sadness that broods over a festival that is finished. Catherine spoke first, setting Jackie on his feet and rising. "Thank you, Mr. Carroll, for everything," she murmured. "I cannot express how good you have been. And you, Stacy." The men had risen too. "Why, my dear girl," Mr. Carroll returned, "you've given us far more happiness than we you." She shook her head. "I must take the boys up now," she said. "I've promised, as it's Christmas Eve, to stay with them just for once while they undress." "You'll come back, Catherine?" Stacy asked. "Yes," she replied, without looking at him. "I'll come back." "Well, sir," said Stacy gaily, when he was left with his father, "aren't you going to open all those bundles?" "Presently, Mr. Carroll replied. "I'll carry them up to my study." "Oh, I say," Stacy protested. "I want to see what you've got." His father shook his head. "There's something better than that waiting for us," he remarked, with a smile. "In the dining room. A bottle of Paul Roget, and some sandwiches, and so forth. Come along." "Well, rather," Stacy exclaimed. "What a happy thought. I'm starved, too, to say nothing of my thirst. You never eat anything at dinner in the excitement of this sort of thing." He wondered a bit that his father had not suggested their waiting for Catherine, then understood suddenly that this was a handsome tribute to himself, an effort to express wordlessly that they, too, Father and son were close friends who needed no one else to help them achieve intimacy. But the first thing Mr. Carroll did was to prepare carefully and set aside a plate of good things to eat. "For Catherine," he explained. Then, with a boyish smile at Stacy, he took the bottle from the cooler, uncorked it, and poured the hissing, pale gold wine into the delicate flaring glasses. "Aren't you ashamed to violate the laws of your country in this way?" asked Stacy. "I'm not doing that," Mr. Carroll returned. "When it comes to whiskey, I do some considerable violating, but this champagne has been in my cellar for years. To your health, son." "To yours, sir," Stacy replied cordially. They touched glasses and drank. They talked, like the good friends they were, in an easy desultory way, while they sipped the wine and ate a little. But all at once Mr. Carroll became silent, then suddenly looked across at his son. "Stacy," he said, "don't be a fool." It was an odd speech, but the oddest thing about it was the tone, which was not rough like the words, but pleading, almost cajoling. Mr. Carroll might have been saying, "Do me a favor, won't you?" Stacy grinned. "Try not to," he said. "Explain." But his father was filling Stacy's glass, and, when he had finished doing this, took more time than seemed necessary to replace the bottle in the cooler and adjust the napkin about its neck. And even then he did not reply at once. "Well," he said at last, with an obvious effort, and not looking at his son, "I mean to say, why the devil don't you ask Catherine to marry you?" Stacy, who had lifted his glass, started so that some of the yellow liquid spilled over upon the tablecloth. He leaned back in his chair, amazed and shocked. "Why, sir, he stammered, then broke off helplessly. "Where will you find anyone who's shown herself as good and sweet and courageous?" Mr. Carroll went on, almost belligerently, as though Catherine's merits were in question. "Nowhere," Stacy replied soberly. It was abhorrent to him to see his deepest emotion, which he hardly admitted even to himself, spilled over the table like the wine. "Well, then?" "There is Phil," Stacy muttered. "Phil is dead," Mr. Carroll answered gravely. "We have all felt his loss. He was a noble character, and you were his closest friend. Just for that he would trust Catherine to you gladly. It would not be he to stand between you." "No," Stacy said in a stifled voice. "I suppose not. It is not Phil. But, please, sir," he begged. His father nodded. "Pretty cheeky of me, I admit, son," he said gruffly. "Wouldn't blame you if you'd grown angry. But you understand how I mean it, "That's all right, Dad, I know," Stacy replied quickly. They finished their supper in an awkward silence. "Well," said Mr. Carroll, rising, "I suppose I'd better get those presents of mine and open them. There'll be a lot of notes to write in reply." Stacy followed him back to the littered drawing room, mechanically almost, because he did not know what else to do. "Want any help, sir?" he asked. "No, thanks," said his father, his arms full of bundles. "I'll be down again after a while." And he went out. Stacy, left alone, stared after him, then walked restlessly down the hall to the library. It was painful to him that his father should have divined his feelings. But this was not the worst. The worst was that, if his father had understood him, so assuredly had Catherine. This grieved Stacy deeply. He had been so careful, he thought. He had never meant to let her see what he felt for her. But she did know. Of course she knew. How stupid he had been. No wonder he found her changed. He could see it all now. His father, it seemed, believed that Catherine could care for Stacy as he for her. But Stacy knew better. She was shocked and saddened by her discovery, uncertain what to do, whether to go away or not, generously anxious not to give pain, all her peace of mind gone. Poor Catherine! Stacy was furious with himself. But this did no good, not the least bit. He shook off his anger impatiently. What was to be done about it? That was the point. How, without putting things into words, which always made them worse, was he to let Katharine know that she could count on him, that he would be merely the friend she wanted him to be? He was puzzling over this when she entered the room. She looked startled when she saw that he was there alone, and paused just inside the door as though half inclined to retreat. It hurt Stacy keenly that she should be afraid of him, and with reason. He had risen and stood facing her, but across the room from her. "Won't you come in?" he asked. "Or would you rather go somewhere else? The dining room? There's luncheon ready for you in there." She shook her head. "No," she answered, "and I'm not hungry." But she did not come farther into the room, and, though she smiled waveringly, Stacy saw the expression of pain, or perhaps fear, in her eyes. "Katharine," he began in a low voice, after a moment, "why is it so hard, and dangerous, to be frank?" "Ought it to be either?" she replied gently. She looked at him steadily as she spoke, but the expression on her face was odd and troubled. There was compassion in it, though. He felt that strongly. Of course, a generous emotion would always be dominant in Katharine. He came a little nearer to her. "Katharine," he said, "I have not meant ever to—" then broke off. It was worse to say things than leave them unspoken, and she would understand them anyway. He tried desperately to call the whole subject off. "Oh," he remarked, with a positively sepulchral gaiety, "Christmas is too emotional. We're good friends, aren't we? And that's all that matters." But she continued to gaze at him in that same odd manner. The very pose of her body made her seem like a creature at bay. And suddenly Stacy's thoughts were swept away like so much rubbish by a wave of sure emotion. He took a step toward Katharine, stretching out his hands impulsively, and all at once she was in his arms, trembling and weeping, her lips raised to his. "Ah, Stacy, didn't you know I loved you?" she murmured presently. "Your father knew." "When?" "Since the evening you quarreled." "Oh," Stacy cried, "was it for love that you defended me?" "You might call it that." She drew a little away from him now, and made him sit down beside her on the divan. "I think," she said gently, holding his hand against her cheek, "that men can hardly ever think in facts. They must think in patterns, and anything that will not fit into a pattern they find wrong. But I want to tell you the truth. I have always loved you, Stacy, always. It was not disloyalty. I am sure Phil knew. I loved you and him. It was different. I can't make you understand." Stacy, very shaken and confused, and not understanding anything save, humbly, that this was giving on a scale beyond what was credible, drew her to him and kissed her hot face. "Oh, Stacy," she murmured, "I feel so immodest." "Aha," he interrupted, laughing unsteadily. "Now who's thinking not like an individual, but like the whole female sex?" And at this she, too, laughed a little. They sat there, close together, scarcely speaking. But it came over Stacy in a rush that in his love for Katharine there was a touch of what he had felt for Marion, and something more, far more. Truth, fact, it was complete. This was reality. There was nothing left out. "Katharine," he cried, "you are not only a grown woman, you are a little girl too. And so I'm not afraid of you any longer. I always was a little, you know. Now I'm not." "That's odd," she said shyly, "because I have always been afraid of you a little." "But really, on account of my temper, I suppose. You're right, I've a rotten temper," he said remorsefully. She smiled. "No, not on account of your temper. I think," she explained, grave now, It was the serenity you have achieved, Stacy dear." He drew away to stare at her, but before he could speak the door of the room opened and Mr. Carroll entered, then paused abruptly. Catherine saw him first and hurried to his side, clasping his hand in both of hers and laying her head against his shoulder. Mr. Carroll reached out his other hand to grasp Stacy's and gazed at his son with shining eyes. "Oh, Mr. Carroll, do you mind?" Catherine cried softly. "Mind, my dear?" he replied. "Isn't it exactly what I've hoped for?" And he bent down and kissed her cheek, then made her sit down beside him on the divan, while Stacy stood a little way off, looking at them. Where were you thinking of living?" Mr. Carroll asked presently, in a carefully matter-of-fact voice, while he slowly clipped off the end of a cigar. Stacy flashed a swift, questioning glance at Catherine. "Why," he remarked, then deliberately, "what with the scarcity of houses and all, we were rather thinking of staying on here." "Well," said Mr. Carroll, "if you will, you will, I suppose." But he had paused to light his cigar before speaking, and it had taken him rather longer than usual. End of chapter 26. End of The Lonely Warrior by Claude C. Washburn. Recording by Lee Smalley.